This is Audible.
Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Killer on the Fens by Joy Ellis, narrated by Henrietta Meir. Chapter 1. Detective Inspector Nikki Galena's face was a mask of concentration as she accelerated her powerful car along the dangerous Fenland lanes. Long shadows were forming as the evening drew in, and she was grateful that she'd actually paid attention during her advanced driving course. This was the second time in a week that she had received a call from the nursing home about her father's failing health. Wicked bloody disease, Nikki cursed as she eased the car around a deceptively sharp bend. The Alzheimer's had stolen most of his once astute brain years ago, but now he was in what the home called end stage, and although she had been told this could go on for a long time, her gut feeling said otherwise. As soon as she saw the smart painted sign for the Glenfield nursing home, Nikki wondered what she would find when she got there. There had been something in the voice of the specialist nurse who had phoned her. Nothing was said, but she had detected an added anxiety in the tone and had begun to prepare herself. All her visits to her father were harrowing. The mere fact that he didn't know her was bad enough, but when she remembered what a strong man he had been, it broke her heart. The airman, a fighter pilot who had flown Harrier jump jets in the Falklands War, now lay in bed or roamed the hallways of the home, with the memory circuits of his brain crashing and burning out. Nikki pulled into a parking space and turned off the engine. His health wasn't the only thing that was worrying her. Recently she had been convinced that there was something he desperately wanted to tell her. Sadly it seemed that he had left it too long, and now she might never know what it was, other than that it concerned someone called Eve. In one scarily lucid moment, he had grabbed her wrist and begged her to find Eve. For a second or two, his eyes had cleared and shone with a frightening intensity. "For pity's sake, Nikki, you're a bloody detective. Find Eve." But what could Nikki say to him? She didn't know anyone by that name. She locked the car and hurried up to the main doors, where to her concern she saw Molly Crane, her father's personal nurse, running towards her. "Dear Galena, thank God you got here so quickly." The nurse's face was etched with worry. "The situation has altered since we rang you." She turned and rushed Nikki towards the lift. "I didn't ring again as I knew you'd be driving." "What's happened?" asked Nikki, not really wanting to know the answer. "He's had a seizure." Molly stabbed her finger on the button, and the lift door sighed open. "Were you with him?" asked Nikki, desperate to know that her dad had not been alone or frightened. "Oh, yes, I haven't left him for a minute. I was just checking his medication, and without any warning he had a catastrophic reaction." Molly Crane shook her head. "It's not something we expect to see in the late stages, but nevertheless it happened." The lift juddered to a halt, and as they hurried out, the nurse explained what she meant. "It's a moment of intense emotional pain. We think it's caused by a flash of realization, of true awareness of their plight, and it triggers extreme distress. It usually ends in the patient lashing out, either physically or verbally." She looked at Nikki. "Your father knocked over his bedside table and fought to get out of bed. By the time I raised the alarm, he had collapsed. The doctor is with him now, and there's an ambulance on its way." Minutes later, Nikki watched dumbly as the doctor checked her father's vital signs, then lifted the lids and stared into his unfocused eyes. She didn't have to ask how he was doing. The expression on the doctor's face said it all. "He's not going to pull through this time, is he?" Nikki was no fool. She had spent more time than she would have liked in and around hospitals, and knew a lot about illness. "I'm guessing he's had a cerebral hemorrhage." "Massive, I'd say, and he's weakening." Nikki looked at the man and whispered, "Then please, just let him go. He's been in hell for years. Don't try to bring him back now he has the chance of freedom." The doctor hesitated, then looked down at his patient. After a moment he said, "I agree. He wouldn't survive the trip to the hospital. We'll just make him as comfortable as possible." Molly went out of the room, and Nikki could hear her speaking to someone. Then she returned, closed the door, and softly said, "I've cancelled the ambulance." Nikki took her father's hand and smiled at him, and suddenly the frail husk of a human being became her dad again, her lovely father, Wing Commander Frank Reed. Nikki? Molly's hand was on her arm, and Nikki was vaguely aware that the nurse had never called her by her first name before. His breathing's changed. Chain-stoke respiration, said the doctor solemnly. His heart is failing. For one moment, Nikki thought he would stop the awful irregular breathing and wake up, but instead, the eyes flickered for a moment, then he let out a long sigh. She looked up at Molly and saw a strange expression pass across the nurse's face. She'd heard it too. There had been one word hidden deep in that sigh. Eve. The doctor gently touched his neck. He's gone. Nikki didn't move. Then her mind began to race. There had been times when she had prayed for him to die. It hadn't been a selfish prayer. She just knew what an independent and proud man he was, and how having strangers attending to his every need would have utterly destroyed what was left of him. And now he had gone. Nikki felt terrible guilt at the relief that was flooding through her, and she also felt an irrational anger, because he had left her with an unanswered question, a stranger's name in his dying breath. Then the anger disappeared as she looked at her father's ashen face. She remembered the good times, the fun they had had when she was a child, and the unconditional love that he had always given her. Bye, Dad. She leaned across and kissed his forehead. And if it helps, I will find her for you. Somehow, I will find Eve. I promise. Chapter 2. The young man knew the treacherous marsh paths better than most, especially at night. He'd spent all his early years around Castor Fen and Flaxton Mere, but this evening was going to be the last time that he would tramp those boggy, uneven tracks. As he loped along, his scrawny body casting a stick-thin shadow in the moonlight, he decided that it had all been worth it. All the lies, the deceit, the begging, borrowing, and mainly stealing, all worth it. By tomorrow morning he would be gone from here, and for the first time in his life he would have some money in his pocket, some real money. Prior to tonight, his whole existence had been one shitty mess, and although his problems were not quite over, he could at last allow himself a little smile. He was nearly there. The moonlight made the desolate landscape appear weird and dreamlike. It reflected on dark pools of brackish water, making them look as wholesome as waste engine oil. Finally he came to a narrow path that led away from the sea bank, the long high-flood defence that formed a barrier between the salt marsh and solid ground. He looked up and saw the strange, imposing silhouette of the old deserted airfield, RAF Flaxton Mere. As he got closer, he could feel a nervousness steal over him. He'd been coming here for months, but it still gave him the creeps. Dark and brooding, the old buildings had been left to rot after World War II, but incredibly, they had survived. Right now, one of them was doing a great job providing a pretty clever hiding place for his big secret. The clusters of shrubby trees were getting thicker, and he felt more relaxed as he blended into the shadowy thickets. He'd never yet met anyone out here, but there had been nights when he had been certain that he wasn't alone. And it wasn't anything to do with Flaxton Mere's scary reputation, although it didn't help growing up with a grandmother who firmly believed in ghosts and ghouls. He stopped in his tracks as a heavy curtain of night clouds blocked the moon. Then a shaft of moonlight escaped from the cloud, and like a spotlight to center stage, he saw the rotting wooden door of the old storehouse. He moved stealthily across a stretch of open ground in front of the building and slipped inside. It took him just a few minutes to retrieve his prize, and with a wider smile, he pushed the large package into his rucksack and hurried back outside. Now all he had to do was lie low until morning and not be late for his 2 prearranged meetings. He exhaled stale breath. After that, he would be gone, like the proverbial thief in the night. He retraced his footsteps towards the perimeter fence of the airfield, then made his way towards one of several old concrete pillboxes that surrounded the place. With one last look around, he ducked down and went inside. As accommodation went, this would do very nicely for a night. Even the smell was not too bad. His own bedsit had smelt a lot worse after he'd had a skinful. Kicking some rubble and other rubbish to one side, he pulled a faded and tatty sleeping bag from his holdall and laid it on the floor. He crawled in, carefully taking the package with him, and felt almost comfortable. He didn't expect to sleep, He didn't want to. He didn't dare. He just wanted to feel relatively safe. If he overslept and missed his meetings, then the consequences didn't bear thinking about, and not only for him, but his old Gran too. He curled up in a ball and congratulated himself. This place had been a stroke of bloody genius. No one ever came here. The locals, a rustic group of inbreds as far as he was concerned, never set foot on this desolate strip of land. According to them, it was the nerve centre of every ghostly and diabolical happening that folklore could come up with. He giggled at their stupidity. He'd lived in the town for long enough now to distance himself from his own rural background, and he loved his Gran enough to forgive her anything, including her crackpot beliefs. He shifted around and tried to find a flatter area to lie on. No, there was nothing to fear out here, except perhaps him, and he was certainly not very nice to know. A sound outside suddenly made him sit up. It was an odd noise. It was recognizable, all right, yet surely it could not be. With a grunt of concern, he scrambled out of the sleeping bag, stuffed his precious parcel into the loose waistband of his trousers, crouched down, and hurried outside. He searched the sky for the source of the noise. It was definitely a plane. The heavens were almost cloud-free, and the moon much lower than it had been. He could see nothing, but the distinctive roar of an engine was getting louder. In desperation, he clambered up onto the roof of the pillbox and stared around. It was not one of the jet fighters that day and night crashed through the Lincolnshire skies, and it sounded too powerful to be a light aircraft. Jesus! It was some kind of heavy-engined military plane, and shit, it was in trouble. The steady roar was suddenly irregular, a heart-stopping silence, then a stuttering choking as the engine struggled to cut in again. He spun around full circle on the concrete roof, and his heart jumped when he remembered the state of the runways, cracked, broken, non-existent in places. A death trap for anyone who thought they could bring a crippled plane down there. The deafening noise was all around him, and for the second time that night, he sweated with fear. The terrible cacophony stopped. He heard the sound of a rushing wind, then only silence. He stood, some 7 or 8 feet up in the air, like a great stone jack-in-the-box. Then, from a little way away, he heard a dull, earth-jarring thump, and he caught sight of flames flickering close to the remains of the old control tower. His hand flew to his mouth, and adrenaline pumped through him. Everything that was important to him, the exchange, the payoff, the threat to his Gran, and the promised release from the stifling shithole that he had landed in, all screamed at him to run. But somewhere deep inside, in that underused part of him that constituted his soul, he knew he had to go to the accident site. He wanted to help. But if there was ever going to be a time to choose, he never found out. The next sound sent him clambering and falling from the pillbox and running away with his hands clasped tightly to his ears and his addled mind almost at breaking point. He was surrounded by the horrors of an air raid. The wailing sirens, urgent shouts and screaming, and all the horrible sounds of suffering that went with it. He didn't understand, and he wasn't waiting around for an explanation. He just ran. A short way ahead, he could dimly make out a gap in the wire. Not lessening his speed, he turned and headed for it, then caught his foot in a snare of barbed wire and pitched forward into a pile of rubble. Pain coursing through his lacerated ankle and still struggling to find his footing, he was suddenly aware that loose rocks and small stones were sliding away from under his worn and slippery-soled sneakers. Then his gut turned over as he found himself hurtling downwards, cracking his elbows, knees and head against solid stone. Before his body crashed into the floor of the old ventilation shaft, he was vaguely aware that the only scream he could now hear was his own. Chapter 3. Nikki stared at Superintendent Greg Woodhull and wondered how to tell him that she had no intention of taking the compassionate leave that he was offering her. The older man's face was full of sympathy, but Nikki knew that time to herself was the last thing she needed. Naturally, there were the funeral arrangements to make, but her father had been typical old-school RAF, ordered and methodical. The family solicitor had already assured her that he had put his house in order the moment the Alzheimer's had reared its ugly head. "I'm all time off anyway. I'll do what I have to do, but I really need to keep working, sir." Greg peered over his glasses at her and nodded. "I've known you since you were a probationer, Nikki, so I expected that. But don't forget, it's a difficult time, and the grieving process takes everyone differently. When everything is arranged, by all means continue to work, but remember, if you need to take some time out, you can." "Funny thing is, I don't actually feel anything right now. Well, not in the same way I did when Hannah died. Memories of her daughter flooded round her, and Nikki sat back in her chair and sighed. Maybe it's this job. From the moment we join up, we learn to deal with death, don't we? In 100 different guises, added the superintendent grimly. He smiled sadly at her. And in a way, because of his illness, your father died some time ago, didn't he? You've probably been grieving his loss for months, maybe years. Don't be too hard on yourself, Nikki. There's no rule book with sections and subsections that defines the exact method for grieving. That's true, I guess, said Nikki. It's just that when you spend years hardening yourself to death, you're always scared that you'll take it a step too far, and one day you'll wake up having lost the ability to feel anything at all. Greg snorted. Then his smile widened. You'll never do that. You can be the hard-arsed Iron Lady of Greenborough, Nick, when you need to be, but I promise you that you'll never lose the warmth in your heart. That's good to hear. Nikki straightened up. So, if it's all right with you, sir, and considering the fact that my sergeant has taken a few days' leave himself, I'll keep things ticking over here and attend to my personal arrangements in tandem. Greg shrugged. I wouldn't say I'm exactly happy about it, but you do whatever you need to. Just don't burn out. I'm sure Joseph would come back in and cover for you under the circumstances. That's exactly what I don't want, sir, stated Nikki. Joseph has his daughter Tamsin staying with him. No way am I going to ruin that long-awaited reunion. Greg looked at her with interest. Rick Bainbridge told me something about that before he retired. The girl went with the mother when Joseph's marriage failed, isn't that it? Nikki nodded. That's right. This visit is a very big thing for Joseph. Nikki knew more than anyone else about DS Joseph Easter's private life. Both she and Joseph had always been loners, private people with murky histories and secrets they had never shared. That was until they came together as an unwilling team in the Fenland Constabulary's Greenborough CID and found that, although they were total opposites, they shared a lot of common ground. And one area was their daughters. She'd had Hannah, her only child, a beautiful teenager who'd died 18 months ago. Joseph's girl, Tamsin, was intelligent and sparky, but lived halfway around the world, and had spent her early life hating him. Nikki thought carefully about that. Actually, Tamsin hated the man that Joseph used to be, a career soldier, a special services operative, highly skilled and trained to kill. But Nikki knew that man no longer existed, and she prayed that Tamsin would now see her father as he really was, a caring, brave, and loyal police officer. A man who had never once given up on getting his daughter back. Does Joseph know about your father's death? Asked the superintendent. Yes, I rang him the night before last, sir, and it was my day off yesterday, so he came over and we had a long heart-to-heart. He offered to help, but I'd already registered the death and seen the solicitor. Things are very straightforward. The family home is already in my name, and due to the nature of his illness, I hold power of attorney. She shrugged and threw her boss a weak smile. Plus, our solicitor said that my father left very clear instructions as to what he wants for the funeral, and it's exactly what I would have expected from him. He wanted to be cremated, very quiet, no fuss, no flowers, Elga's Nimrod and donations to the Alzheimer's Society. When will the funeral take place? Around 9 or 10 days' time, I think, sir. Some of the relatives are getting on a bit and they have travel arrangements to make, so I'm giving them as long as I can. She was about to tell the superintendent that she didn't want the whole station knowing about her father, when a uniformed officer knocked sharply on the door. Sorry to interrupt, but if it's convenient, the duty sergeant needs you downstairs, ma'am. Greg raised his eyebrows and gave her a wry smile. Go. Rick also warned me that this station cannot function without your presence at every single incident. Nikki hurried after the man, and as they entered the front office, she found the place in uproar. WPC Collins, go get PC Farrow now. Nikki watched as a uniformed constable ran from the room. What the hell is going on, Sarge? Kid down a well, way out on Flaxton Mere Marsh. Fire services has got him out and he's in Greenborough ITU. And that's the reason for everyone to leap around like lunatics. There's more to it than a simple pussy down a well. Trumpton thinks we might like to take a look at him. Nikki noticed that the uniformed sergeant was smirking slightly. Oh, did I forget to mention the very large bag of white stuff and assorted other drugs stuffed down his trousers? He raised his eyebrows innocently. Really? Now that is interesting. She paused. Why didn't we get the shout straight away? Why now, when the kid is already in hospital? The sergeant shrugged. The anonymous caller who reported it only asked for an ambulance. The paramedics radioed for the fire service to bring out their emergency gear for rescuing fallen climbers. We got missed out somewhere along the line. Oh, the injured man is touch and go, by the way. Do we know who he is? Asked Nikki. Not yet, and forgive me for cutting this short, but if I don't get Yvonne and Niall down to that hospital, someone else might get their sticky mitts on that bag of junk. Too right, said Nikki, but I'll attend. Tell them to meet me there. I hoped you'd say that, Mom. No problem, I'm on it. Nikki threw back as she hurried from the office. She met the crew in the hospital foyer, and Nikki smiled at them as they hurried towards her. WPC Yvonne Collins was one of the keystones on which Greenborough Police Station was built. She had a lot of years under her belt, an encyclopedic knowledge of the low life of the Fenland town, and a deep love of policing. She took no crap from anyone, villains and coppers alike, and although she could recite Butterworth's police law verbatim, she knew how to apply compassion and common sense to its complex legalities. In short, she was Nikki's kind of police officer. She glanced across to Yvonne's crewmate PC Niall Farrow. He too fitted the criteria, but in a very different way. Niall was young, good-looking, and full of enthusiasm. He was bursting with old-fashioned zeal to catch the bad guys and save the world. Oh, the old Bill has made it at last. Better late than never, guys. A fireman leaning casually against the side of a vending machine threw them a smug smile. Oh, great, muttered Yvonne as they hurried down the corridor. Of all the crews that could have got this shout, it had to be Dice. Nikki grunted in agreement, then answered the fireman nicknamed Dice. Sorry, but as no one bothered to call us, and my crystal ball being in for a service, you know how it is. She threw up her hands in mock desperation. You've got something for us? The big man flopped into a waiting area chair, causing it to creak loudly. Nikki watched, half hoping that it would give way, but sadly it stayed firm beneath the broad buttocks. Sure have, and I think you may have an interesting little case here, dear Galena. The police officers grumbled, but the fireman continued undeterred. A lone man, about 20+ years of age, out in the middle of nowhere, smashed out of his brains, with nothing on him other than a fortune in stuff. He raised his eyebrows. Nice one, huh? Nikki bridled. Dice was famous for buttonholing police officers and bombarding them with his Sherlockian theories. He might be a great firefighter, but he was a rubbish detective, and most police officers avoided him like the plague. Maybe. Her reply was terse. Now, hand it over. Dice reluctantly passed her the bag. Quite a haul. Apart from the heroin and the coke, there are bennies, dexies, poppers, E's, crystal meth, special K, and a whole load of stuff that I don't even recognise. He leaned back, causing the chair to groan even more. Do you know what I think? No, but I think you've just tampered with evidence, Dice. All done properly, Inspector. We had to open the bag as the doc needed to know what the kid had taken. The fireman held up a gloved hand. Now, as I was saying, I noted that although he was high as a kite when we got him out of that old ventilation shaft— oh, and that's what it was, by the way, not a well as first reported— he wasn't a needle man, because there were no tracks on his arms. Thanks, Dice. It's great to know that your observational skills are working so well, but we need to see the doctor, and I'm sure you've got a nice inferno somewhere to attend to. Nikki gathered up Yvonne and Niall, and they made a hurried exit. They waited for about half an hour before the doctor who had admitted the unknown male could see them. Finally he turned up, looking bedraggled, tired, and most undoctor-like in scuffed trainers, a faded rugby top, and equally faded jeans. I'm Dr. Tim Bolton. Sorry to have kept you waiting. He extended a hand and took them into the relatives' room. He was thin, lank-haired, sported a heavy 5 o'clock shadow, and appeared to have existed without sleep for at least a month. What can you tell us about his injuries? Nikki and Yvonne both had their notebooks open, while Niall remained standing by the door. He is suffering from exposure, hypothermia, a head injury, the extent of which we don't know, although we doubt it is too serious, and a severely damaged leg. The leg is giving us more cause for concern than anything else. There is a possibility that he will lose it, and there is a tiny fact that he has taken an enormous quantity of drugs, which is why he hasn't regained consciousness. We know what he took, and it appears he was trying to kill the pain. Sadly, there was no identification on him. Nikki frowned. Do you think he was stoned before he fell down the hole? Doubtful. I think he was simply attempting his own form of analgesia, and if you saw the state of his leg, you'd know why. How long do you think he'd be down there, Dr. Bolton? From the extent of the infection in the leg wound and from his general condition, I'd say around 2 days. Yvonne looked up from her notes. What are his chances of recovery, Doctor? The doctor puffed out his cheeks and shook his head. At a guess, 70-30 against. He's very weak. I reckon another hour underground and the fire crew would have brought up a dead body. Has he been conscious at all? For a while, in resus, he was mumbling gibberish, but then he took a dive. They lost him for a few seconds, but the crash team got him back. Would we be able to take a look at him? Yvonne asked hopefully. Certainly. Anything else I can help you with? Nikki frowned. You said he was mumbling. Anything coherent? It sounded like he needed to be somewhere important. We think he was saying must get there. Then shortly afterwards he crashed. Does he have any distinguishing marks? Yvonne asked. Tattoos? Scars? Oh yes, a tiny tattoo on his left forearm. Nothing professional, and it's well faded. A school kid thing with a blade and some ink, probably. What is it? The doctor shrugged. Hard to say. An amateur attempt at a dagger, maybe. Nikki added that to her notes. That will help. She stood up. One last thing. Was there anything to suggest that the fall was not accidental? All I can say is that his injuries seem to be consistent with a steep fall onto a solid surface. I saw nothing to make me believe it was anything other than accident, but please, that's just my opinion, not a full medical assessment. Don't worry, that's all I was asking for. Thanks for your time, Doctor. Nikki, Yvonne and Niall waited outside ITU until a nurse beckoned them in. The sounds, the smells, and the high-octane atmosphere in the intensive care unit were all too familiar to Nikki. She recognised perhaps 60% of the staff, and, as their work allowed, they all acknowledged her with either a wave or a word of greeting. Between them, they had kept her daughter alive for 3 years, and even though they had eventually lost her, she remained forever grateful for their efforts. Where there was life, there was hope, and until the very end, Nikki had never given up on a miracle for Hannah. Nikki tried not to look around at the other patients, at their injuries or their distress, and instead stared down at the injured young man. His features were narrow, pointed, weasel-like, with bad skin and stained teeth, but he was no one that she recognised. Either of you know him? She asked. No, said Niall definitely, but Yvonne stared thoughtfully at the thin, pale face. I've never arrested him, that's for sure, but there's something about him that's familiar. I've certainly seen him around Greenborough. There's this. His nurse lifted the unconscious man's arm and pointed to the faded bluish tattoo. Prison tat? Asked Niall. No, the doc's right, it's kid stuff. If he were older, I'd say it was blatant misuse of school ink. Nikki frowned, and any self-respecting parent would have hung him out to dry for doing that to himself. Yvonne grimaced. I'd suggest that this bloke's parents wouldn't know self-respect if it bit their arse. Everything about this young man spells breadline. So, if he's not known to us and he's skint, how come he's got a damn great bag of drugs on him? Niall countered. I think you just answered your own question, my friend, said Yvonne. I reckon he's had it with being broke and is trying to rectify the situation. Nikki turned to the nurse. Jan, how long before he wakes up? The nurse shrugged. It's more of a case of will he wake up, I'm afraid. He took enough analgesic to see him to the other side of the sticks. She gently touched his face. Poor guy was in agony. He must have thought that help would never get to him. She pointed to the leg, carefully suspended in a frame, and raised off the bed. Worst compound fracture I've seen in years. 2 shards of what was left of his shin bone had ripped clear through his skin, and apparently he was found lying in several inches of dirty water. He must have spent 2 nights down there like that. Doesn't bear thinking about. Can't exactly blame him for sarpling his wares then, can you? Said Niall grimly. No, Nikki exhaled. He may be a villain of one sort or another, but no one deserves that. Well, there's nothing more we can do here, but I'd like one of you to remain with him in case he wakes. I'll stay, Mum, Yvonne offered. I certainly can't put a name to him right now, but maybe it will come back to me. Nikki nodded. OK then, Niall, you come with me. We'd better turn this rather valuable packet in at the station, then get ourselves out to the spot where he was found. She turned to Yvonne. Ring me direct if he says anything. We'll go, Ma'am. Nikki took a last look around the busy ward, then left the injured young man to the mercy of the machines, respirators, and fluid-filled tubes that snaked around his corpse-like body. As they drove from the hospital, Nikki suddenly had a picture in her head of a woman called Stephanie Taylor. She had been haunting the station for days now, asking for help in finding her missing brother, Anson. The problem was that Anson was not someone the police were particularly interested in finding. He was a 23-year-old male, in good health, both physically and mentally, and could by no stretch of the imagination be referred to as vulnerable. And although they had never pinned anything on him, they were pretty certain that Anson was an up-and-coming drug dealer. The fact that he was apparently missing was, in their book, very good news. The best the police could offer Stephanie Taylor was a number for the Missing Persons Bureau. Nikki tried to recall what Anson Taylor had looked like, but the only dealings she had ever had with him had been years ago when he was a spotty, gobby little kid, and she knew all too well that drugs could change a person, making them unrecognizable. As soon as they were back at base, she'd ring Stephanie Taylor. She didn't think it was Anson, but the mystery man had been in possession of a large quantity of drugs, which would point to dealing, so there was a chance that they had inadvertently found her missing brother. Nikki slowed down as a traffic light changed to red. "Niall, where exactly did they say the ventilation shaft was?" "Right out on the perimeters of the old World War II airfield at Flaxton Mere, Ma'am, quite close to the sea bank and the marshes, I suspect." "You sound like you know the area." Niall tilted his head to one side. "I guess I do. When I was a kid, my dad and I used to bring his metal detector out here, and we walk around the old airfield looking for spent shell cases and bits of shrapnel." He grinned at her. "I found a World War II medal once, all battered. I decided that it had belonged to a fighter ace that had been blown out of the skies over the mere. Great stuff." "And you still read the Eagle?" "I probably would if they still printed it, Ma'am. As it is, I have to make do with X-Men." Niall sighed a little wistfully. "I really loved Dan Dare." "Why doesn't that surprise me?" Nikki smiled at the young policeman and accelerated away from the junction and back towards the station. As she drove, her thoughts went to what had happened. What the hell had a drug dealer been doing in such an out-of-the-way spot? He was miles from anywhere. She'd been out to Flaxton Mere herself as a young mum, taking little Hannah for picnics on the sea bank. She recalled the strange place with a mixture of emotions. Feelings of melancholy, because it was a remote and lonely part of the fen, and exhilaration brought about by the huge skies and the unending vista of wetlands and silver water. Nikki suddenly braked, then swung the car round. "Sod getting drugs back to base. They're safe enough with us. We're halfway to the fen already, and there's no time like the present. Radio control and tell them what we're doing. We'll go renew your acquaintanceship with that desolate dump that was once RAF Flaxton Mere right now." She grinned at him. "You never know. You might find another medal." As it turned out, there was nothing to see, just a deep hole in the ground with some blue and white cordoning tape fixed around it. A mud-splattered police car sat silently at the end of the track that led to the sea bank, and two bored-looking uniformed officers stood close to the shaft to protect the scene and make sure that no other poor sod fell down it. Not that anyone would, because no one in their right mind would go there in the first place. "I'd forgotten just what a desolate bog this part of the fen is." Nikki looked out over the dreary marshland. "There are places along this stretch where you never hear a bird sing. Something to do with the air currents. They kind of swallow up sound. It can be quite disturbing if you happen to be out here alone." Niall kicked at some loose shingle and watched as it splashed into a deep puddle. "It's a different world, isn't it, Mom? Really weird." He grimaced. "And so are the locals. Half of them belong in the Middle Ages. They thrive on superstition." He looked around. "And who can blame them? Look at this place." "I used to think it was beautiful, all mysterious and otherworldly." Nikki drew in a deep breath. "Now, I'm not so sure. Apart from the silent thing, the marsh along this stretch of the coast has always had a bad reputation." She stared away from the lagoons of dark water and across to where the gloomy hulk of the old deserted control tower sat brooding over the bleak landscape. Even on a bright sunny day, the ruined building had a sinister feel to it. "I'm amazed that so many of the old structures are still standing. I would have thought most of the old World War II watch offices had been demolished." "You're right, but this place is in pretty good nick, isn't it?" He looked around, eyes narrowed in the sunlight. "There are still engine sheds and ammunition stores. Yvonne was telling me that the owner of Flaxton Mere has laid on water and electricity to some of the old hangars, and he lets them out to small traders as business units." "For small, read dodgy." added Nikki. "No one with a reputable business would operate from a cesspit like this." She frowned. "Maybe we should pay them an unannounced visit. I'm willing to bet there won't be a legit man among them." "Yvonne would really like that, Mom. She's been on about it for months, but as there have been no actual complaints about the place, the sergeant said it would be a waste of resources." "We'll see about that, shall we? Do you know who the owner is, Niall?" "As far as I can recall, it's a bloke by the name of Shine, Carl Shine. He bought it from the military a few years ago." "With what intention?" "Don't rightly know, Mum, but I know a woman who will." He grinned. "I suggest you consult the Oracle WPC Collins. If she knows as much as she usually does about the locals, then she'll tell you everything about Shine, from his taste in wine to his star sign." "I'll do that, although I'm not sure I care too much about his position in the zodiac. And right now, I see little point in hanging around here." Nikki shook her head. What the hell was a guy loaded with thousands of pounds worth of drugs doing out here in this wilderness? "Sorry, Mom." Niall shrugged. "Ask me one on sport." Chapter 4. "What is it with you?" The desk sergeant looked at D.I. Joseph Easter and threw his hands in the air. "If I got a chance to get out of here, I'd stay out. Aren't you off duty for a few days?" Joseph grinned. "I am, but my daughter has discovered the Greenborough shopping centre, so I thought I'd just check in, see if anything exciting is happening." The sergeant pointed to the door. "Ask your boss." "Mom?" Joseph stepped forward as Nikki and Niall hurried into the foyer. "Go home! You're on leave!" called out Nikki. "And so are you, or you should be," returned Joseph, so that only she could hear. "Hell, Nikki, you've got a funeral to organise." He looked at her with concern in his eyes. "So what is so important that you are rushing around like a mad thing?" "Nothing for you to worry about. You have a daughter and several years to catch up on, so go." He knew that despite her dismissive tone, she was glad he was there. "Tamsin's meeting me here when she's finished in town." Joseph's face creased into a frown. "So while I wait, tell me what's going on." Nikki gave him a brief rundown and held up the fat bag of assorted drugs. Joseph drew in a breath. "Oh my, I don't think you'll get away with for personal use only as an excuse, do you? And do you think the injured man is that missing dealer, Anson Taylor?" "My gut says no, but I'm about to ring his sister and get her to take a look at him." Nikki went into her office, found the woman's number, and punched it into the phone. "Are we still on for dinner at your place?" she asked as she waited for a reply. "All prepared, and Tamsin's really looking forward to seeing you again. I think she's quite excited about tonight." "Really?" Nikki grinned suspiciously. "Dinner with two old fogey coppers? Are you sure about that?" Her smile faded as she turned her attention to the phone. "Stephanie Taylor? It's D.I. Galena here, of Greenborough CID. I'm sorry to bother you, but I wonder if you might be able to help us." Joseph listened as Nikki explained what had happened, while keeping one eye on the office door for his daughter. He got the feeling that Tamsin had actually arranged to meet him here in order to accidentally bump into Niall Farrow again. Joseph knew that the two had kept in touch after getting thrown together in a dangerous situation a while back, and although Tamsin hotly denied it, Joseph smelt romance in the air, and he had to admit that his daughter was really making an effort this time to heal the old wounds and the rift between them. It certainly wasn't plain sailing. In fact, for the last 2 days, from dawn to dusk, they had been tiptoeing around each other. The expression, walking on eggshells, had never sounded so right. But then this was a big thing, and Joseph knew that if he wanted to win back his daughter's love, he had to get it right this time, because there would be no second chances. Nikki thanked the woman and promised to send a car round to take her to the hospital. Then she looked at Joseph incredulously. "Well, that's a turn-up for the books. I was wrong. It seems that Anson does have a homemade tattoo after all. I'm glad that WPC Yvonne Collins is already in ITU. She'll escort Stephanie in, and we'll just have to take it from there." Joseph nodded. "Can't do any more. So, how are the funeral arrangements going? Is there anything I can help with?" "To be honest, Joseph, there's not much to do." Nikki exhaled. "My dad had everything sorted eons ago. He'd even paid for the funeral. I've put an obituary in the Telegraph and the local papers, booked the garden restaurant in town for afterwards." Nikki raised her eyebrows. "And I spent hours last night chasing down relatives I've never even met, and his old RAF cronies. So much for a small, quiet service. I'm beginning to think he had more mates than a lottery winner." Joseph suddenly thought about his conversation with Nikki immediately after the old man had died. In his last coherent sentence, he had told her to find someone called Eve. No mention of an Eve, I suppose? Nikki's face clouded. Funnily enough, there was one old guy, a man named Tug Owen, or Squadron Leader Anthony Blake Owen, to be absolutely correct. I seem to recall meeting him years ago. He was a great buddy of my father, and Dad had left a request that I pass on all his medals and RAF memorabilia to Tug. I mentioned the name Eve, and I swear he knew about her, but he clammed up tighter than a duck's backside. Her frown deepened. I wish I had a bit more free time for all that, but I guess it'll have to wait. Joseph noticed Nikki's worried expression and decided to make a suggestion. I've been thinking, while you're busy here, perhaps Tamsin and I could do a bit of sleuthing for you. You said that your father had a lot of photo albums and letters stored in your attic. Perhaps if you've no objection to us nosing through them, we might find a clue to Eve's identity. Nikki nodded vigorously. If you're sure, that would be great. I was going to ask you if you'd mind getting the boxes down for me. No problem. How about after dinner tonight we all go back to your place for coffee? I'll do it then. He looked at her and bit his lip. And to be honest, it would be doing me a favour too. It's pretty hard going trying to put years of hurt behind you. It could just work as a bonding exercise, and at the very least the distraction might help to fill some of the strained silences. She's still a staunch pacifist, even now. Nothing like she used to be. I think she's mellowing, but I don't think she'll ever forgive me for spending years clasping a Heckler and Cock HK-417 rifle to my breast. She was just a kid then, Joseph. If she's half the person you are, now that she's all grown up, she'll realise that the past doesn't exist anymore, and her father is, and always was, a good man. Joseph felt a jolt of wistfulness. It was his greatest wish, but even though things were going pretty well, he wasn't sure that it would happen. She had promised a year ago to spend more quality time with him, but it had never materialised. Now Tamsin was only staying with him because of a major hiccup in her travel plans with her mother. One call from Laura, and Tamsin would be jetting off again. He was on borrowed time, and he was horribly conscious of the ticking clock. Nikki indicated towards the CID room door. Speaking of angels... Joseph's daughter, tall, willowy, with her father's light brown hair and thoughtful, expressive eyes, was deep in conversation with PC Niall Farrow. The young constable looked across to Joseph and grinned. Hello, Sarge. I found this gorgeous young lady in the foyer, so thought I should escort her safely to you. Joseph looked at them together and decided that his suspicions were correct. Guess what, Dad? Niall's sister Ellie works for the Lincolnshire Wildlife Trust, and we were on the field course together after uni. How's that for a cool coincidence? Niall says she's studying the seals at Donanook, and if I'm still around, he'll take me up there on his free day. That's a great idea, said Joseph, and meant it. If nothing else, Niall could prove to be an ally, and help keep Tamsin close to him. After Niall left, Tamsin ran over to Nikki and gave her a hug. Dad told me about your father, Nikki. I'm so very sorry. Nikki looked mildly surprised, but very pleased at the girl's thoughtfulness, and in no time they were chatting easily. Joseph watched them together and felt a stab of sadness as he thought of what Nikki was missing, with her own daughter so cruelly taken from her. We should get back, said Joseph. We've got a car full of shopping, and as we have a guest tonight, I have culinary tasks to attend to. And I have to get back to work, Nikki sighed. I'll see you both later. Yvonne looked up to see one of her colleagues leading an anxious-looking woman down the hospital corridor towards her. She left the busy ITU and met them outside. Stephanie Taylor was a homely woman, probably much younger than she appeared. Her clothes were far from new, but they were clean and neatly pressed. There was nothing about her appearance that would lead you to believe she might be connected with a drug dealer, and Yvonne, who prided herself on being a pretty shrewd judge of character, felt an immediate liking for her. Thank you so much for coming, she said gently. I'm afraid he's very poorly, so please don't get your hopes up. They walked through the door and up to the bed. Yvonne placed her hand gently on Steph's shoulder and jumped when the woman suddenly gave a bark of laughter. Pike! Yvonne led her quickly out of the room and went to get her a drink of water. Stephanie sat, shaking and clasping her arms around herself. She took the glass and stared into it for a while before speaking. I'm so sorry. I guess I'd psyched myself up to see my brother. She gave a little derisory snort. And I find him lying there instead. She sipped the water, then took a deep breath. His name is William Pike. He's a friend of my brother, and he was the first one I rang when Anson never came home. He swore he hadn't seen him. Yvonne wrote down his address. Have you any idea why we'd have been out on the marsh at Flaxton Mere? None at all, but then Pike isn't exactly the brightest light on the Christmas tree. He could have been up to any of a dozen harebrained schemes. Steph looked up at Yvonne. Do you have a brother, WPC Collins? I do. 2 younger brothers. So can you appreciate how I feel? No matter how close to death Pike is, I'm still glad, because it's not my Anson in that bed. Yvonne nodded, pictured her own lovely brothers, Robin and Harry, and said that yes, she understood. But what about the tattoo? They both had them. Blood brothers, would you believe? I nearly went mad when I saw Anson's arm. Naturally, it had been Pike's stupid idea. As a child, he used Anson as a crutch, always leant on him, copied his homework, leached his pocket money, and talked him into doing really stupid things. I'd have tested him, but Anson acted like his big brother. I wouldn't like to tell you how many scrapes he got that little bastard out of. Pike is a parasite, always has been. Her eyes filled with tears. I'm sure he knows where my brother is, and if Anson's in trouble, it will have been Pike's fault. You can be sure of that. She almost spat out the last sentence. Funny that he's not known to us, given his predilection for trouble. Yvonne frowned. The name rings a few bells, but I'm certain he doesn't have a record. He doesn't, but only because somehow Anson has always managed to save his skin for him. Does he have any family that we can contact? No, the mother ran off soon after he was born, and the father died a year or so ago. He does have a grandmother, from his dad's side of the family. She lives somewhere out in the marshes, I think. And her name? Steph thought for a while. Sorry, but he just called her Granny Pike. Yvonne frowned. She remembered hearing the desk sergeant take a call the day before about a missing old lady. She could have sworn the name was Pike. But whatever, it wasn't this woman's problem. I'll get my colleague to take you home, Miss Taylor, and in the light of everything that's happened, I'm sure there will now be a search for your brother. Relief showed in her eyes, and Yvonne felt guilty. Stephanie Taylor was thinking they would be looking for her Anson out of concern for his safety, but Yvonne knew that they would mostly be looking for him as a suspect for attempted murder. Steph Taylor doesn't know the old lady's name, just said he called her Gran, but I'm certain the missing woman from the marsh was called Pike. Could you check it for me, Mum? Nikki scrolled down the report on her computer. Got it, and you're right, Yvonne. It is Pike. She sucked in air. This just gets better and better. We have one missing drug dealer, a half-dead junkie down a hole, and now his aged granny magicked away from her home. Great. And the crew that checked out the old girl's home said there was blood at the scene, added Yvonne. Sounds pretty iffy, doesn't it, Mum? Let's just hope Pike wakes up pretty soon and gives us some answers. Has anyone arrived to take over from you? I'd like you back here. I need you to tell me all you know about the guy who owns Flaxton Mere, and then I suggest we go visit him. Yes, Ma'am. My relief is already here. I'll get on the road. Good. Report to me when you arrive. Nikki hung up, then saw the 2 other members of her team entering the CID room. Over here, guys, she called out. DC Cat Cullen threw her leather jacket over the back of her chair and moved quickly towards Nikki's office. It was hard to believe that when Nikki had taken Cat under her wing, the girl had been an outsider, on the verge of being sent back to uniform. She was undoubtedly smart, but none of the teams had wanted a maverick with a timekeeping issue. None except for Nikki, who had not only recognized something of herself in the girl, but had seen untapped talents and decided to take a risk. Even after being seriously injured and bearing scars to prove it, Cat had ploughed straight back in, never giving Nikki less than 100%. As a young detective entered her office, and Nikki saw the excited expression on her face, she knew, not for the first time, that her gamble had paid off, with bonuses. Cat grinned at her and ran a slender hand through her spiky, rough-cut hair. We've tied up that spate of fuel thefts out at Hawker's Drove, Ma'am. Got the little bastard safely in the custody suite, and enough solid evidence to make even the CPS cracker smile. Really good work. Well done, both of you. Nikki looked at the last member to join her team and saw him swell with pride. DC Dave Harris had been another reject that she had gathered up and found a diamond beneath the shabby exterior. She had seen through the facade that he put up to cover a painful home life and discovered a true old-style Bobby with all the right values. Dave didn't like technology. He came to his conclusions using a combination of long-term experience on the force, logic, and simple intuition. He was in his 50s, heavier than he should be, and certainly no modern man, but he got results. And for some reason, he and the thoroughly modern, high-tech Cat Cullen gelled perfectly. Nikki sat back and allowed herself to feel pretty pleased with her team. Okay, they weren't exactly classic cops. They had started out as a seriously dysfunctional group of misfits. Maybe that was their secret, because now they were hard to beat when it came to arrest and conviction rates. "Close the door, Dave. I've something to tell you, and I'd prefer it stayed with us for the moment." Nikki told them about her father, and it wasn't easy because Dave's wife, who also had Alzheimer's, had died only a year ago, and she knew he was still hurting. "So I may be in and out a bit over the next few days, tying up details, but I have decided I'd rather keep working." Both officers offered their condolences. Then Dave added, "I don't blame you, Mum. I wish I'd done the same when my Lizzie passed away. It's a big mistake to take too much time out, especially when you're on your own." He gave her a sad smile. "But anything we can do to help, just ask, okay?" "Definitely," Kat added. "Anything at all, Mom." Nikki thanked them, but somehow felt that her words sounded hollow. She still felt no emotion welling up. No tears threatened to engulf her. "Well, back to work." She told them about Pike, the drugs, and the ventilation shaft, then passed some copies of a report that had just arrived from Uniform as to the status of the search for his missing grandmother. "According to the crew who dealt with it, Grandma Pike lives alone out on the marshes at Caster Fen. She's the local Fenlanders' version of a vet by all accounts, and she takes in stray animals." Nikki paused and thumbed through the report. "A chap named Bourne called on her the night before last with a sick pup, but she wasn't there. He returned the next morning and she still wasn't around. As she never went out, and she always left the key under a flower pot, he let himself in. Said the place was a tip. Looked like there had been a struggle. There was blood on the hearth, and he reckoned some of her animals had gone too." "It makes no sense," said Dave, rubbing thoughtfully at his chin. "I agree," said Nikki, taking a large picture from an envelope in front of her. "And neither does the fact that Pike was wearing this when they pulled him out of the shaft. Can you see any streetwise bloke going out like this?" She showed them a photo of the clothes that Pike had been wearing when he was found, in particular a multicoloured homespun woolly jumper. "And it's new." "That's gross," said Kat flatly. "It's the sort your gran knits you for Christmas and you never wear," said Dave with a pained expression on his face. "I suffered quite a few of those in my childhood." Nikki nodded. "So we can only guess that he wore it to please her." "But where is she? How the hell can a little old lady disappear off the face of the fen?" grumbled Kat, staring at the printouts. "I see that Uniform have started a house-to-house, but in that desolate spot it could take a week." "Right, so have they checked the hospitals?" Nikki asked, "especially ones out of the area?" "Yep." Kat ran a finger down the list. "Boston, Skeggy, Lincoln, Grantham, Peterborough, plus all the cottage hospitals. Apparently none of them have an unknown 80-year-old female that they'd like claimed." "Well, unless she turns up living a secret life as a club rep in Iron Apple, or William Pike wakes up, it looks like Granny Pike will be joining Amelia Earhart." "And the blood that was found on the hearth," mused Dave, "was definitely human, but the DNA report will take some time." "Any witness statements? Anyone noticed any recent visitors to the fen? Any strangers?" "Says here that some kid saw a flashy car a few days back," said Dave. "Sounded like an Audi, but he never got a licence number. The consensus is that it was most likely just lost. It happens all the time out there on those marsh lanes." Then we better concentrate on Pike. We need to confirm what Stephanie Taylor told WPC Collins, that the father is brown bread and the mother did a run of donkeys years ago." Nikki sighed. "And we still have Pike's buddy, the wannabe drug baron Anson Taylor, missing." Nikki frowned and rubbed at her temple thoughtfully. "I wonder if Anson and Pike had a fight over those drugs, and Pike finished up down the shaft." She suddenly felt frustrated by the whole thing. No, that doesn't ring true somehow. Why out there in such a remote and desolate area? I've got a distinctly funny feeling about all this. She stood up. She never ignored instinct. "Right, we'll take a closer look at that old airfield. Something drew William Pike to the place, so we can't afford to write it off as just some old deserted ruin. Maybe something is going on out there that shouldn't be." She looked at Kat and Dave. "Start with background. Find out all you can about RAF Flaxton Mere, past and present. Then we'll take a handful of uniforms and do a search. OK, my friends, get digging and keep me posted. As soon as Yvonne is back, I'm going to see the owner of that godforsaken place." "No problem, Mom." Kat gathered up the papers and walked to the door. "We're on it." As the police officers discussed him, the young man called William Pike was staring at a bright, white light. And even though it was very beautiful, he somehow found the strength to refuse to walk down that long tunnel. He was weak and close to death, but he refused to lose his tenuous grip on life. His reason for turning down the generous offer of everlasting peace and choosing to remain in a world of excruciating pain was a simple one. In a moment of lucidity, at some point before he slipped into that deeper state of unconsciousness that they called coma, he had recognized someone in the big, bright room in which he lay. Chapter 5. Carl Shine opened the door of his apartment to find 2 uniformed officers and a senior detective on his doorstep. His stomach lurched, threatening his recently digested dinner, and a feeling of dread surged through him, which was ridiculous, considering he had done nothing wrong. Well, not yet. It was probably just a flashback to the old days. The bad old days. He read their warrant cards, then held back the door and allowed them in. As he indicated the matching leather sofas, he felt a tiny hint of satisfaction as their envious eyes swept around the beautifully furnished room. "We traced a call from a mobile phone, sir. One that was requesting an ambulance to an incident at Flaxton Mere Airfield. The call was anonymous, but it was made from a phone registered to you. Would that be correct, sir?" Carl thought quickly. It was never meant to be anonymous, officers. I was so concerned for the young man down the shaft that as soon as I knew help was on the way, I simply rang off without leaving my details. He threw them what he hoped was a convincing smile. "How is he? Did he make it?" "He's critical, sir," said the detective named Galena, "but if you hadn't found him, he would certainly be dead." The woman looked at him intently, and he found her gaze disturbing. "How did you come to find him?" Carl took a deep breath. "I was just checking the perimeter fences. The airfield is a dangerous place. I put warning notices up all over, but people ignore them, like the man down the shaft." "Did you know him?" asked the male constable, a young man with dark, piercing eyes. "Never seen him before, and before you ask, I have no idea what he was doing. He certainly had no business to be there." "How long have you owned Flaxton Mere, sir?" Carl's heart sank. He really did not want to talk about his investment. It should have changed his life and made him filthy rich, but now it hung around his neck like a rotting albatross, and could see him in debt to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds. 3 years, give or take a month or 2. "And what are your intentions for it, sir?" Fuck all, thought Carl bitterly, although of course that had not always been the case. First there was to be a small estate of prestige housing, then a sympathetic renovation job on the RAF buildings, making them into a heritage museum, followed by more affordable dwellings that would attract southerners who were looking for a place in the country. Oh yes, it was the dream deal, the gilt-edged property investment that couldn't fail. Until he miscalculated the market, held back too long, and a storm of biblical proportions hit the coastline that edged Flaxton Mere, and turned a part of his prime building land into a lake of silt. To be frank, officers, I'm still considering my options. He hoped he looked relaxed and at ease answering their damn fool questions. You can't really lose when you invest in land, can you? And I have several interesting schemes being considered by my people for viability. Carl shifted uncomfortably. It had just occurred to him that this visit from the law regarding his 999 call really didn't warrant 3 officers. There must be something else bringing them to his door, something he wasn't yet aware of. But then they were standing up, thanking him for his time, and preparing to leave. Carl's confusion increased. In a former life and a different location, he'd had plenty of dealings with coppers, and this didn't feel right. "By the way, sir," the uniformed woman constable hung back, "the business units in the old hangars, I assume they are all kosher, rent books, proper tax declarations, all run correctly?" Carl could have laughed out loud. Of course they weren't. They were strictly cash, no lease agreements, and no questions asked about what the hell they were doing. He smiled reassuringly. "Of course, it's all above board. My secretary deals with it. She'll have all the relevant paperwork at the office. You're welcome to call by and check it. Naturally, due to the poor amenities and the distance from the town, they pay very low rents with informal agreements, but when my plans come into operation, their units will be modernised and then new contracts will be drawn up and they will pay accordingly." The policewoman gave him a long stare, one that said, "I've got your number, sunshine, and if you think I believe that, then you're a fool." But what she said was, "Thanks for your time, sir. We'll probably be in touch." Carl held open the door, then casually asked, "I suppose you've finished out at the airfield now?" The detective inspector shook her head. "Not yet, I'm afraid. We need to keep the crime scene secure, sir, and generally keep an eye on the whole area." "Crime scene?" There was an edge to his voice, and he hoped the woman had not picked up on it. "If he dies, it could be murder or manslaughter." "I thought he'd just fallen. Do you mean he was thrown?" "Sorry, sir, but it's like you said yourself. We've no idea how he got there." Carl Shine's mouth went dry. Just how fucking naive could he be? He closed the door and headed straight to the cabinet that contained his scotch. He poured himself 3 fingers and swilled back a good third of it in one hit. He noticed that his hand had a slight tremor, and he wasn't surprised. Just the thought of what was happening out at the airfield was enough to make him shake. What he hadn't told them was that when half the coastline got washed away in the storm, the authorities decided it was cheaper to flood a large area close to Flaxton Mere rather than try to build new sea defences. In 10 years' time, it would be a useless bog, and as the marsh was still encroaching into the land, planning permission would be out of the question. Everything he owned, and one hell of a lot of money that he didn't, was riding on him finding a way out of this shit, and fast. He took another swallow of the whiskey and let out a sigh. Because that wasn't the end of it, was it? When honesty had failed, he had approached someone from his past to help bail him out, and that someone would not be best pleased if he knew that his new project was being crawled all over by the old Bill. Even the thought of the man's reaction to that scenario made Carl feel physically sick. He should never have allowed this to happen. He drank the last of the scotch and poured another. Even losing everything and allowing his fabulous investment to be swallowed up by the North Sea was infinitely better than upsetting the infamous Freddie Carver, and now it looked as if he might have royally pissed him off. Carl sat down on his very expensive leather sofa and allowed his head to sink into his hands. The day before, he had made a deal with the devil, and now he had no idea how he could stop the chain of events that had already swung into action. With another sigh, which was almost a childish whimper, he curled up into a tight ball and closed his eyes. He stayed like that for almost half an hour. Then he slowly sat up and stretched his taut and strained neck muscles. He stood up, stretched again, then walked over to the huge full-length mirror that hung in the hallway. In it he saw the reflection of a smart, well-groomed businessman. The short, stylishly cut dark hair, the casual, trendy clothes, and the Tag Heuer watch all declared affluence. But he smiled bitterly and wondered how long he had before the bailiffs hauled away his home cinema system and his beamer. He stared more deeply at his image, and didn't like what he saw. The man who looked out from behind his eyes was weak and scared. It was all he had ever wanted, to make it big on Straight Street, and stick 2 fingers up at his shady beginnings and every single member of his stinking low-life family. And if the Flaxton Mere enterprise had come off, he would have been richer than any of them would ever have believed. He straightened himself up, then walked back into the lounge and his unfinished single malt. This time, he sipped it. Maybe, just maybe, he could turn this around. He'd have to eat humble pie, but what did he have to lose? He set his empty glass down on the table. What did they say? Desperate times call for desperate measures? He gave a mirthless laugh. Well, they didn't come any more desperate than he was right now. The laugh faded, and he gritted his teeth. Then he picked up his car keys and made for the door to the Integral garage. Chapter 6. That evening, Nikki stood in her bedroom at Cloud Cottage farmhouse and looked out over the marsh. An evening mist had come down in a swirling, hazy mass, but it was far from depressing. In fact, it was spellbinding. It seemed as if she were looking across to the silver-grey waters of the Wash through a gently twisting veil of gossamer silk. And 1/4 mile away, on the very edge of the marsh, she could see the familiar shape of Knott Cottage. A wisp of smoke filtered from one of its 2 chimneys into the even wispier cloudy sky. Joseph had obviously decided that the evenings were still cool enough to warrant keeping the log burner alight. She walked away from the window. It felt comfortable knowing that Joseph was living so close to her, and she thanked God that he had fallen in love with the airy beauty of the Fens and not moved back to the town. She gazed through the almost hypnotic wispy strands of mist to Knott Cottage, and thought about Joseph. He meant so much to her in so many ways, but it was complicated. Wasn't it always, she thought grimly? He was her only neighbour, her trusted work colleague, and her closest friend. And what else? For a while she had believed, well, unless she was completely mistaken, they had both believed that they had a future together. But fear had crept in and ruined the dream. They were too afraid to lose what they already had. She loved him. That was undeniable, but she knew what could happen to two career-minded people in such a volatile job. Best to keep the status quo. As she pulled a sweater over her head, she thought about the circumstances that had brought Joseph's daughter to Greenborough, and the more she considered it, the more she believed that Tamsin really did want some kind of relationship with her father. Joseph's ex-wife had moved from Edinburgh to Chicago and was now a high flyer in the World Health Organization. Her field was surgical safety, and according to Tamsin, they had been about to take a holiday in Switzerland when her mother had been called as an expert witness in a big court case in southern Africa. It could take days or weeks, Tamsin didn't know, but she had decided that she would prefer to be on hand in the UK rather than try to rush out from the States when her mother was finally free. Nikki pulled on some light socks and hunted in the bottom of her wardrobe for her soft leather loafers. Tamsin struck Nikki as the sort of girl who wouldn't think twice about grabbing a bucket seat and flying out at 10 minutes' notice, so she was pretty sure the impromptu stay with her father had actually been carefully planned. As she ran down the stairs and grabbed her keys from the kitchen table, she sincerely hoped she was right. It was just after 9 when they finished the meal, and Nikki raised her glass in Joseph's direction. I have to admit being a trifle anxious when you reminded me that Tamsin was a vegetarian, but that supper was something else. Thank you. Actually, she had almost chickened out when she had heard the word veggie. Nikki watched as Tamsin looked at her father with a mixture of irritation and interest. I told him not to fuss. I have no problem with other people eating whatever they want. Being vegetarian is my choice. I don't inflict my beliefs on anyone else. There was a haughty, almost offensive tone to her voice, and Nikki realized that the girl was fighting with her feelings about her father. But Tamsin obviously didn't feel quite ready to make any decisions about him yet. Well, said Nikki comfortably, if nothing else, I'll never not vegetarian again, and believe me, that's saying something. She is something of a Philistine where food is concerned, added Joseph, although it's very satisfying to have someone clear their plate with such gusto. I'm supposing that's a polite way of calling me a pig, is it? Never. We get called that enough in our line of work, thank you. You just enjoy your food. He raised an eyebrow in her direction. And speaking of appreciating things, if we have coffee over at yours, do you have any of that amazing brandy left? My father's? Yes, I found another 2 bottles squirreled away at home. If you don't mind swinging around in my attic, I'll open one. Deal? An hour later, Tamsin and Nikki, with brandy glasses in their hands, sat on the floor of her lounge, surrounded by cardboard boxes and an assortment of cases. So what are we looking for? Asked Tamsin, carefully thumbing through a sheaf of military-looking papers. Nikki stared at her father's things and wondered if she was up to this. But there would never be a better time. She looked fondly at Joseph and Tamsin. Now was probably as good as it got. Put anything that refers to the RAF to one side, and keep your eyes peeled for the name Eve on letters, backs of photos, notes, anything. Tamsin lifted out a packet of glossy pictures. Is this you? Nikki looked at the young woman with the eager, happy face and the pretty blonde child on a brightly coloured tricycle. Yes, that's me with Hannah. She must have been about 2 in that one. Tamsin looked through the other pictures. Dad told me what happened to Hannah. The girl looked up. I'm so sorry. And now losing your father as well. It must be horrible for you. I don't know how you cope. Some days, I'm not too sure myself. Nikki took a sip of her brandy. And then other days, well, you realise that life throws some pretty grim stuff at everyone at one time or another. You just have to get on with it. You're no good to anyone if you crack up. She thought about her lovely girl, and the long, long time she had spent in the high dependency unit being cared for 24/7. Hannah had been in a persistent vegetative state, one step up from coma, until a simple cold had turned into pneumonia, and she had nothing left to fight with. Sadness swept over her. It was time to change the subject. She pulled the box towards her and began to sift through her father's life. As she did, she told Tamsin all about his last request. Find Eve, whispered Tamsin. Creepy. Stuff like that happens in scary movies, and it usually ends with the heroine up to her armpits in bodies. Thanks for that, Tam. I have to sleep here tonight. Tamsin grinned at her. "I can't imagine you being scared of anything."
"Don't you believe it," said Nikki grimly. "I've seen things in this job that would scare the pants off anyone, me included."
Joseph came back in, having washed off the dust from the loft.
"Don't you think it's rather soon to be doing all this?"
"I'm okay," she said, and decided that she was. Her father had left her with a puzzle to solve, and who better to solve it than a detective? She smiled at them both, sipped her brandy and said, "Okay, A-team, we have a missing woman to find. Let's do it." At 4 a.m, an alarm went off in the intensive care unit. Nurses dashed from their station to a woman's bedside, and the duty doctor and the crash team were called. They pronounced the time of death as 4:26, and the monitors were switched off and disconnected. As the cover was respectfully pulled up over the closed lids of her dead eyes, another alarm sounded, and the team once again began resuscitation, this time on the comatose young man in the next bed. Chapter 7. Kat looked down at the heap of papers strewn across her desk, then back up to her boss. "The internet has thrown up very little about the old RAF station." She stared at some printouts. "In fact, I can find little more than that it was some kind of satellite station, which is pretty hard to believe given its size and the number of buildings there. I looked up a few others of similar size, and they were all major players in World War II, so why no info on Flaxton Mere?"
Dave walked across and joined them. "Maybe it was finished too late and never used. I know they threw everything into these East Coast airfields when the threat of invasion became critical. Then when it never happened, a lot of places were abandoned."
Nikki shrugged.
"Could be, I suppose. Perhaps our wealthy young entrepreneur, Mr. Carl Shine, could tell us more."
Kat gave a snort. "I don't think Mr. Shine wants to tell you anything. It doesn't sound as if he was too happy about your visit yesterday. Niall said, and I quote, 'He was airspring taut and scared shitless, even if he did try to come over super cool.'"
"That lad has a nice way with words. It sums up Mr. Shine a treat."
Nikki perched on the edge of Kat's desk. "Have either of you managed to find anything out about him?"
"Next to nothing," grumbled Dave. "Carl Shine of Martin Park in Greenborough. He just seems to have arrived out of nowhere around 3 years back. He has no record, no past history, and bought a flashy house and that massive chunk of Fenland with seemingly honest earned cash." He paused. "And I believe that crock of shit about as much as I believe there are fairies at the bottom of my garden."
Nikki grimaced.
"Anything else about the airfield?"
Kat turned over a sheet of paper and stared at what she had written. "I noticed that most of the references regarding RAF Flaxton Mere were posted by a man called Joshua Flower. I googled him and found out that he's a professor of some kind and the chairman of the local Greenborough Antiquarian Society. Reading his blog, it seems there is a branch of the History Society that is passionate about old airfields, Flaxton Mere in particular."
"Then he sounds like the man to talk to, doesn't he?"
"He's out at present, but I've already rung and left a message on his answer machine." Kat looked up. "Dave and I will pay him a visit ASAP."
"Good. And is that all we have?" "Apart from the fact that we get more calls about unexplained disturbances in the Flaxton Fen and Caster Fen areas than anywhere else in the whole county," said Dave.
"And most, I suppose, from our beloved Miss Quinny?"
asked Nikki wryly.
"Ah, yes, mysterious lights on the marsh, unexplained sightings of men in dark clothes on the sea bank in the dead of night, and weird noises that scare her chickens." Kat rolled her eyes heavenward. "Last time, as I recall, it was an alien landing in her raspberry canes."
Nikki stood up. "Well, apart from all that, I've asked Uniform to keep up their presence at the airfield until either Pike wakes up, or we've managed to do a thorough search of the old buildings."
She looked down at Kat.
"If Mr. Shine is not exactly forthcoming with us, I'd definitely try to involve your history professor. He might be prepared to be a tour guide if he knows so much about the place."
Kat nodded. "My thoughts precisely."
"Good. Now I'm going to slip out for an hour. There are some things of my father's that I need to collect from the nursing home."
Dave stood up.
"Want some company, Gov?"
Nikki shook her head. "Thanks for the offer, Dave. I do appreciate it, but I'm fine. You get on, and try to find some history on this Shine guy. Everyone has a history, and if it's hard to find, then, in my book, it's been purposely hidden, and is bound to be shady." On the way to Glenfield, Nikki called into the local supermarket and bought several bottles of wine and a thank you card for the staff. When she arrived there, she was met by Molly Crane, and she was glad that she'd made the effort. "I know how busy you are, dear Galena, so I thought it might help if I packed his things up for you." Molly ushered her into the manager's office, where she saw 3 boxes and an old leather case sitting together under the window. "Everything is there, as per the inventory of his belongings, plus a few things he accumulated." She sat in one chair and indicated for Nikki to take the other. "I need you to check and sign if you wouldn't mind." She smiled at Nikki. "Can I make you a coffee? Or a tea?" "Black coffee. 1 sugar would be great, thank you," said Nikki. "And I don't need to check his things, Molly. He had nothing of value here. And anyway, I trust you." Molly went out to the kitchen and returned a few minutes later with 2 mugs of coffee. "I'm glad you came in, dear Galena. I was going to call you." Nikki took her drink. "Why was that?" "Well, it may be nothing, but then again—" Molly Crane placed her mug on the desk and walked over to the boxes. She opened one and pulled out an old, well-thumbed book. Nikki didn't recognize it as her father's, but took it from Molly and opened it. Inside was an inscription, and there was no doubt in her mind that the writing belonged to her dad. "For my watcher in the night, may this while away the hours until dawn. F. Kiss." Nikki stared at it and frowned. "I've never seen it before, and I brought all his things in, so where did it come from?" Molly shrugged. "I have no idea, although he did have several old friends visit while he was here. It was at the back of his bedside cabinet. It was a title that caught my attention." "The Eve of War. Eve. I see what you mean," Nikki said. "As I said, it may be nothing at all, but there is something else. A picture fell out when I opened it. Look in the back." Between the last page and the cover of the old book was a photograph. It was a 6x4 snap, the kind people took prior to the advent of digital cameras. Nikki held it closer. It was taken abroad, and most likely on an airbase. 4 tanned men and 2 women sat and stood round a plastic table. Most had drinks in their hands, and 2 of the glasses were lifted in a salute to the photographer. Nikki wasn't sure, but she thought that one of the young men might be Tug Owen. The others meant nothing to her. "I wonder if one of those women was his watcher in the night," said Molly. "I think I know this man here." Nikki pointed to the handsome young airman. "He's coming to the funeral, so I will certainly ask him." She looked up at the nurse, and after a moment said, "Molly, I didn't imagine it, did I?" The woman shook her head. "No, I heard it too. He said Eve. I'm certain of it." Nikki nodded, but said no more. Freddie Carver stepped from the jacuzzi, and clutching the empty champagne flute in one pudgy hand, walked slowly along the length of his turquoise marble pool. He glanced at the row of exotic palms in huge ornate pottery containers and made a mental note to tell the gardener to clean them more regularly. He paused at the poolside bar and refilled his glass, then picked up the bottle and moved slowly towards the sauna. He lowered his considerable bulk down onto the wooden slats and breathed in the hot, humid air. He was in a foul temper, which was not like him. 3 things had upset him already, and he'd only been out of bed an hour. First, the team of surveyors he had sent out to Flaxton Mere had returned with the news that they had only been on site for a matter of hours when the perimeter road close to the seabank side of the mere filled up with blue lights and uniforms. They had pulled out immediately using a different route, but they were far from happy at having had such a close call with the fuzz. The second thing that had riled him was a visit from Carl Shine, babbling about an accident, some kid falling down a hole. Shine had repeated over and over that there was absolutely nothing to worry about. It had only been the emergency services getting the kid out, nothing else. He'd sworn that he would take care of everything and ring when the airfield was clear again. Freddie sipped his drink and slowly shook his head. He knew from Shine's tone and body language that he was holding something back, and Freddie didn't like that, not one bit. Because of old family ties and a liking for the boy's determination, he had sent out some top men and state-of-the-art equipment in order to discover exactly what they could do to salvage young Carl's innovative little project. And his men were special, highly experienced and highly paid, and they rarely worked on lawful assignments. If there were a way to make serious money out of Shine's pipe dream, then they would find it. But they did not work under the watchful gaze of the filth. And then there was a third thing, equally as upsetting to Freddie. His clumsy cow of a wife had dropped a bottle of Bollinger. All in all, a great start to the day. He sat back, thinking murderous thoughts and wondering what the hell had gone wrong with Carl Shine. Years ago the boy had shown great promise. He had been clear-minded and cunning. Freddie had liked that. and would have put money on the lad doing well. Then Carl had suddenly developed a yearning for the legitimate business of the world, and it seemed that he did have a good try at it. But there you go. Honesty never paid off, not if you wanted to be seriously and quickly rich. Freddie emptied his glass and reached for the dark green bottle. He needed the drink to think clearly, and right now he was worried. Something odd had occurred when his men retreated from the airfield. His top man, an Irishman called Michael Finn, had not been with them. None of the others had seen him leave, but his truck had gone, and no one had heard from him since, including his wife. Now his phone was not answering, which gave Freddie grave cause for concern. Michael was helping him out with Flaxton Mere as a favour, because of his expertise with maps and surveying. He was deeply involved in something far bigger than Carl Shine's miserable little enterprise, and that really worried Freddie. A key man in the biggest job he had ever undertaken had gone missing, and he was going to have to send out one of his very private investigators to find him, which would cost even more big money. He swallowed a mouthful of champagne and decided to give Shine 2 days to get the pigs off his patch. If Carly Baby couldn't manage that, then he was on his own. Chapter 8. Carl got out to the airfield early. He hoped he had managed to placate Freddie, but you could never tell with that slimy bastard. Whatever, he'd done his best, and right now he had other fish to fry. But first he had to visit the men who rented the units. He needed to play down the police presence and make sure that none of them did a runner without paying their rent. Money was getting scarce, and he couldn't afford to throw it away. The sky was heavy with cloud, and it was difficult to see even as far as the creepy old ruin of a control tower. Carl shivered. He had walked through it once or twice when he first purchased the land, and, unaccountably, it gave him the heebie-jeebies. Even so, he could see the potential of the place if it were restored and full of authentic RAF and wartime shit. Sorry, memorabilia. Okay, Freddie had told him to shelve that idea and concentrate on housing, and he'd keep the old toad sweet, but if the old man could salvage Flaxton Mere for him, there were so many other possibilities. He gave himself a mental shake. He was getting too far ahead of himself, and right now he had worries on a par with full-thickness burns. Among them was the fact that one of Freddie's men had gone missing during his abbreviated visit to Flaxton Mere. As Carl walked across to the old hangars, he tried to put a face to Michael Flynn. Only one man had stood out from the group of taciturn men that had arrived the day before. He was tall, with raven-black hair and strangely pale blue eyes. He was certainly Irish, and had been the only one of Freddie's men to even acknowledge his presence. In fact, he had seemed quite sociable, unlike his colleagues who had looked at Carl as if he was some kind of retard. They were not openly hostile, but they were far from friendly. And they told him nothing. They were in Freddie Carver's pay, and they clearly dealt only with him. Carl felt like the office junior, and kept expecting them to send him out for coffee and donuts. He pulled a face, and thought miserably that if it hadn't been for the men's animosity towards him, he would never have left them and gone out to check the perimeter fences in the first place. And the shaft containing the injured man might have gone undiscovered for months. He sighed. He wasn't a cruel person. He'd been on the wrong end of that particular trait in his childhood, but part of him wished that he'd never chanced to cross the man down the hole. More than anything, he regretted calling the emergency services. If he'd just thought about himself and the fact that a crew of Freddie Carver's shady surveyors were working on his airfield, then maybe he could have found the courage to walk away. Seeing one of his tenants unlocking their unit door brought him back to ground level. No use going over it all again. What was done was done. The best he could do now was pacify these guys and get the old Bill off his land as quickly as possible. An hour later, he left the last of the disgruntled unit holders and made his way back to his Beamer. He'd have a friendly word with the resident police officer parked next to his car, just to see if there was any news of their departure. Then he'd take himself into town for something to eat.
"Hello, Mr. Shine, and how are we today?"
Carl's heart sank. That voice could only belong to the geek from the History Society, Professor Joshua Bloody Flower. Carl looked across to the hard standing close to the control tower, and his heart sank even further. Another car was parked there. Great. He'd brought some of his cronies, too. Just what Carl needed. "Sorry, Professor, this is not a good time. We have the police here with us."
"And that is exactly why we are here, sir. We have just heard about the dreadful accident, and we wondered if we could offer our assistance."
"Thank you, but no, Professor." The irritation in his voice was impossible to hide. The shower of weirdos was the last straw. "I'm sure the police have everything in hand.
Now, if you wouldn't mind leaving." "Wait." The policeman walked towards them. "And you are?" Joshua Flower stepped forward. He was an imposing figure of around 60, with a full head of wavy grey hair. He was wearing his usual old-style clothes, a tweed jacket with a moleskin waistcoat, and ancient cord trousers in a strange ochre colour that made Carl feel mildly queasy. Flower made a small bow, carefully enunciated his name, and introduced the three others: "Marcus Selby, Andrew Fryer, and Frank Kohler. My apologies, Constable. We are members of Greenborough History Society, and we have a particular interest in World War II airfields." "And what sort of assistance do you think you can offer, sir?" Carl Shine was beginning to feel uncomfortable. The tall bird-like chap called Selby answered, "We know this place better than anyone, officer." He turned to Carl with an almost apologetic expression on his face. "No offence to you, Mr. Shine. It's partly because of your kindness in letting us research the airfield that we've spent years looking into its history, and we know that there is more to RAF Flaxton Mere than meets the eye." Carl's discomfort was becoming acute. A different voice chimed in. "And it's dangerous for those who don't know it. The man down the hall is proof of that." The policeman looked interested. "At present, we are only interested in what happened at the shaft, but if we need to investigate the old buildings, we may call on you." He opened his notebook. "I'll get your names, gentlemen. Then I think perhaps you should do as Mr. Shine says and leave." Carl watched helplessly as they gave their details. He'd only given them permission to spend time in the old buildings because he thought he could use their collective knowledge for free when he began his renovation project. Now the nosy bastards knew more about the place than he did, and what the hell did they mean by there being more to Flaxton Mere than met the eye? His brain began to go into overdrive. Hell, if there were secrets here, he needed to know about them before Freddie Carver's men came back on site. Part of him wanted to grab hold of Flower by his stupid tweed lapels and ask him what the hell they meant, but right now he wanted them gone. He smiled with difficulty and watched them walk away. All he could do was to wait until later, then go over the place with a fine tooth comb. He had the keys. He owned the place, for heaven's sake. He'd have to check it out and pray that he discovered whatever he'd missed before. Freddie Carver wouldn't want any more nasty surprises. That was for sure. Stephanie Taylor had taken to walking the streets of Greenborough, after the shock of having believed her brother to be dying, and then finding out that it was Pike lying in that hospital bed. She had begun once again to look for Anson. She wasn't stupid enough to think the police would do much, and if they did, it would be because they wanted to question him regarding Pike's accident, so it was down to her to find him. She had started by going out at night, talking to the winos, the dossers, and the kids who slept in shop doorways, but she'd soon realize that the dross of society was still there in the bright light of day, if you knew where to look. And close to noon, in a shadowy alley, wrapped tightly into a filthy sleeping bag and surrounded by cardboard boxes, she found someone that she was looking for. A few nights ago, the girl had been on the verge of talking to her, then something had spooked her, and she had taken off like a greyhound. This time the young woman didn't run away, although getting her to talk did not prove easy. Rather than mess around, Steph simply offered her money, £20 if she knew anything that would help her find Anson. The woman had looked at Steph suspiciously. "No catches? Just the money?" Steph held the note out. "It's all I've got, but it's yours if you help me." The woman extracted her gloved hand. "I don't know much." "Whatever you know is a damn sight more than I do. Please." A small hand reached out, and Steph saw frightened eyes and a face that belonged to someone who was little more than a child. The girl could not have been more than 15. Horrified, Steph handed over the note and sat down on the filthy pavement next to her. "My brother is Anson Taylor. He's missing and—" Her voice tailed off. "You're not like him." The voice was soft and surprisingly well-spoken. "I used to buy from him sometimes, or from his scummy little friend." She shivered a bit when she spoke of Pike. "I hear he's had an accident." Steph ignored the remark. "Have you seen Anson?" The girl was busy pushing the £20 note deep into her baggy layers of clothing. "Last Saturday night I needed a hit, but I couldn't find my usual supplier. I was getting really shaky, then I saw Pike. I called out to him, but he never heard me. He was walking fast, head down, and then a few minutes later I saw Anson following him. Even though I needed a line, I didn't call out. There was something about him." She paused. "He looked mad as hell, and he was obviously tailing Pike." Steph whistled softly through her teeth, then half whispered, half growled, I knew it had to be something to do with that bastard Pike. Where did they go?
I don't know, but I've seen Pike go off before, and always in the direction of the marsh. Steph thought about what she'd been told. Pike had been found in a shaft on Flaxton Mere. Had that been where her brother was going too? She thanked the girl, almost wishing she had more to give her. After all, although she hated to admit it, it was the likes of Anson who kept kids like this high as kites and living rough. As she approached her home in Mason Street, something deep inside her told that Anson was dead, and that he was somewhere on Flaxton Mere. But how would she convince the authorities of it? Even if they found her, the young addict would never repeat to the police what she had told Steph. Even though she knew in her heart it was true, who on earth would believe her? As she slipped the key into the door, she thought that there was one person who might understand. With a glimmer of hope, Steph decided to contact WPC Yvonne Collins. Chapter 9. As Nikki walked into the reception area of the police station, she saw Stephanie Taylor talking to Yvonne Collins. Steph's face was almost grey, and Nikki suspected that the woman had neither eaten nor slept for days.
"Have you got a moment, ma'am?"
asked Yvonne, looking worriedly at Nikki. She nodded, then beckoned the two women in the direction of a spare interview room. It didn't take long to realise that Steph had been far more successful in her investigations than they had. But then she was looking for someone she loved, and that gave her one hell of an incentive. To begin with, Steph seemed reluctant to talk, but after a while she seemed to come to a decision to trust Nikki. She told them all she knew, and filled them in on a few facts about Anson's childhood that had never found their way into a police file. And all through the conversation, Nikki kept feeling sharp stabs of recognition when the girl spoke of the way she felt about her wayward sibling. In Nikki's case, it wasn't a sibling, but trying to keep a headstrong teenage daughter on the straight and narrow had been an exhausting task.
"I find it hard to describe how I feel."
Steph stared at the table in front of her.
"There's an emptiness, a coldness deep down that tells me he's dead. I hope you can understand that."
She sighed.
"What I can't expect you to understand is that I know he is out on Flaxton Mere. I can't explain it, but I know it's true."
Nikki knew that the woman believed in what she was saying, but whether that was just because of what had happened to Pike, or simply because that had been the direction he was going in when he was seen for the last time, she didn't know. It certainly was not enough reason to send officers back out onto the fen. The super had already given her a breakdown of their budget for the month, and if it got any worse, they would be doing high-speed chases on mountain bikes. After a while, she sent Yvonne out to get the woman a coffee. Then she thanked Steph for coming in and promised that they would do all they could, although she knew that might be limited. As the woman nodded sadly, Nikki leaned forward and touched her hand. "I do understand, even though I don't have a brother. My daughter was a problem for a while. I know it's not the same thing, but sometimes the actions of people you love can tear your heart out, can't they?" Steph smiled helplessly.
"I keep thinking about all the times we argued over Pike, how Anson always took his side. I just hope he knew I only ever wanted the best for him."
Her voice tailed off, and Nikki saw a tear glistening in the corner of the woman's tired eyes. She's grieving already, thought Nikki, and felt something like envy. She wanted to grieve for her dad, but still, there was just a void. Yvonne brought in the coffees, and Nikki left the two women together. "There's no rush, Steph. Stay with WPC Collins and take your time, okay?"
"Thank you, dear Galena. I appreciate it."
She paused.
"And thank you for not thinking I'm just some flaky airhead. One day, you'll see I'm right about Anson."
Nikki closed the door with the feeling that Stephanie Taylor was going to be proved correct on all counts. The CID room was buzzing as Nikki walked in. "Glad you're here, Ma'am." Dave waved to her. "We've just heard from ITU that William Pike crashed last night, but they managed to get him back, and he's regained partial consciousness." "Good. Is someone with him?" "Yes, but Yvonne Collins has asked to be told when he's awake, because she'd like to talk to him herself." "She's downstairs in interview room 2. Give her a few minutes to finish up, then tell her to get over to the hospital. What state is Pike in?" "He's confused, but the doctors hope he'll be a little more coherent soon." Dave stared down at some scribbled notes. "We have had no luck with locating Granny Pike. Uniform haven't come up with a lead from the house to house, so I was rather wondering if we could give it to the media, see if they can help." Nikki nodded. "I think we should. Little old ladies don't vanish, even on creepy Flaxton Fen." "It's the same with Anson Taylor, Ma'am.
Nothing on him either, but I guess we won't mention him to the media for obvious reasons.
Nikki exhaled.
Yvonne and I have just spoken to his sister.
She flopped down in a chair and told Dave everything Steph had said, including her feeling that he was dead somewhere on the fen.
He could well be.
Dave looked a little sad.
It's a bummer, isn't it? That woman adores her shitty brother, but unless we get something more concrete, I can't see the budget allowing us to go back out there to search for him. Can you, Mom?
Nikki grunted.
No way, but go ahead and organise something about Granny Pike.
Gov. Kat sat down opposite her. I've been thinking about the drugs that Pike was carrying. What were they exactly?
Dave fished through a pile of reports, then listed a mixed bag of lethal goodies.
Why?
Asked Nikki.
They just bother me. Quite a few officers have intimated that it was a simple deal that went wrong. In other words, Pike making a collection from a supplier. Well, from what I've seen before, suppliers don't deal in odds and sods. A small bag of Dexies, a handful of K, and although there was a heck of a lot of it, the white stuff wasn't even in one package, was it? I reckon he had been squirreling this stuff away, stealing from the dealer that we know he worked for.
She did an imaginary drum roll.
Da-da! Anson Taylor. So if what the street addict told Stephanie Taylor was right, about Anson being mad as hell and following Pike, he could have discovered that fact for himself.
Nikki nodded. I think you're right, Kat. It certainly makes sense. I think we'll give the fragrant Pike a chance to wake up and tell us something constructive, and if that doesn't happen, we may have to take another walk around the airfield. In the meantime, Dave, gee up the media and keep your finger on the search for Granny. She frowned. I don't like the idea of old people going missing. Something about this really stinks.
Dave nodded and rose to go.
It's not just the old lady, is it? Her animals are missing too. So what the heck is that all about? I wish I knew, Dave. I really do.
By afternoon, the police presence at Flaxton had dwindled to 2 bored officers, one pacing the area by the ventilator shaft and one in the car reading a copy of The Sun. And that was perfect, as far as Carl Shine was concerned. No one would take any interest in him as he walked around, checking locks and conscientiously making sure the place was secure. The police didn't know that he was really trying to find out what the hell was going on, and what secrets this place harboured that he didn't know about. As he methodically went from one spot to the next, he wished he'd had more time for the historians. They had offered to take him round on several occasions, but he'd always refused. Pushing aside a long strand of brambles, he thought perhaps he should ring one of them. It could save him a lot of time. Then he thought of Freddie Carver, and decided not to involve anyone else, unless he met with a dead end. Which was just what he did an hour later, covered in cobwebs and with his shiny shoes scuffed and dusty. Standing on one leg at a time, he rubbed his shoes on the back of his trouser legs before climbing into his nice clean car. He pulled a Mars bar from the glove compartment and chewed on it as he pondered on what to do. Should he ring one of the boring old sods and ask them outright, or should he just forget about what Selby had said? The problem was that the man had said it to a copper who had taken careful note of it. Ergo, he shouldn't be the one to stick his head in the sand and ignore it. And with Freddie in the background, he couldn't afford to. He needed to be on top of everything that was happening at the airfield. If anything else went wrong, he could really regret ever approaching Carver for help. He screwed up the sweet wrapper, turned the key in the ignition, and listened to the gentle purr of the powerful engine. He'd better go home and find a phone number for one of them. It probably didn't matter which one he asked. 6 of them all professed to be experts on the place. He had no doubt that one of the enthusiasts would be absolutely delighted to introduce him to the secrets of Flaxton Mere. Tamsin pulled yet another pile of old photographs from the shoebox and looked up at her father. Are you sure you don't fancy your boss? Joseph raised his eyebrows. Oh, Lord, how many more times? We just get on really well, that's all. He stared at the large brown packing case that they had brought across from Nikki's farmhouse the night before, and decided that they were never going to find the mysterious Eve. This doesn't feel right to me, rifling through other people's personal letters and memories. Tamsin looked surprised, and a little accusatory. I would have thought it was right up your street. Surely it's a job requirement for the police. It's different when you're dealing with a crime. This is private stuff. All the same, I think maybe it's better that we do it, don't you? She looked at her father shrewdly. You may get on really well, as you keep telling me, but I don't think you are aware that Nikki's struggling. Joseph sat down on the floor next to his daughter. I thought she was coping brilliantly. Tamsin gave a snort of derision. Men, you only see what's on the surface. Trust me, D.I. Nikki Galena may not know it herself, but she's holding it together by a shoestring. She frowned, and this Eve thing has really got to her. Joseph puffed out his cheeks. Then maybe you're right. He pointed to the mass of papers, letters, and photos. Perhaps it is better that we deal with it. Ah, light dawns, muttered Tamsin, and I suggest that when Nikki gets home, you collect the rest of her boxes and you and I put our collective brains into solving this. A look of confusion passed swiftly across her face. It was as if she didn't want him to think that she might actually be enjoying working with him, so she added, Might as well do something constructive while I wait for my mother to call. Joseph chose not to comment, but looked instead at the open laptop that lay on the carpet next to Tamsin. What's that for? As you do actually have a surprisingly half-decent broadband speed out here in the back of Beyond, I'm tracing Nikki's father's military history from some of the details in these letters, and I'm trying to Google some of the names mentioned. She pointed to 3 neat piles of photographs. This is all forces stuff, this one is family, and this last pile, she shrugged, could be anything. There are landscapes and civilians, but no indication of what, where, or who they are. Anything interesting? I've started with these. Tamsin passed him 9 or 10 photos, all of smiling RAF personnel. These pictures have names and dates on the back. By a process of elimination, you can identify some of the people. She jabbed her finger at one man. This porky bloke in fatigues. He's only in one shot, and the only name that isn't repeated on the other pictures is Lenny Courtney, so meet Fat Lenny. She placed the picture to one side. The same with this woman with the tragic haircut. Her name has to be Mary Fielding. Have you ever considered a career in the police force? You've worked that out quicker than half of CID. When hell freezes over, Tamsin flung back. I want a job that promotes peace, helps needy people, and saves lives. Funnily enough, said Joseph quietly, that's exactly what we strive for in the police force. Tamsin grunted and shifted further away from him. Oh, you know what I mean. Joseph did, and he also knew that the next few days with his emotionally mixed-up daughter were not going to be easy. Mr. Carver, sir, can we meet? Freddie recognised the rasp in the voice and realised that his private investigator did not wish to talk on the phone. 1 hour, Monk, the usual place. Freddie pulled on a long, dark and very expensive overcoat that he had purchased with the sole purpose of disguising his growing paunch, and called for his driver. He kissed his over-tanned young wife and said, I'll be out for lunch, Angel. Try not to demolish the rest of the bubbly while I'm gone. The front, a noisy and popular cocktail bar that attracted young, wine-swilling and upwardly mobile locals, was a smart move on Freddie's part. It was his, of course, a nice little money spinner, but heavily concealed with a shell company. And the 2 comfortable rooms upstairs were for his exclusive use, one as a private meeting place and one as a bedroom that his darling wife knew nothing about. Monk arrived minutes after him and readily accepted the offer of a drink. It's to do with the airfield, sir. Michael Finn was definitely out there with the rest of the crew, but, as you know, he never made it home to his digs. Michael's wife in Ireland hasn't heard from him, and what's even more worrying, neither is his contact on your other job. Now. He paused for effect, but seeing his boss's face, seemed to think better of it and hurried on. I spoke to this kid who lives in a shitty little fen cottage on the edge of the marsh. He was playing there earlier in the day, and he saw a man who, from the boy's description, had to be Michael Finn. I then showed him a picture of Finn, and he positively identified him. The kid said that he had some really fancy handheld computer and seemed to be measuring the land and taking notes, and what I understood to be soil samples. So, he was certainly there and working. Oh, yes, sir, but later on, the same kid saw a truck up on the path at the back of the airfield. The boy said he couldn't see the driver, but he said that the same dark-haired man was asleep in the passenger seat. Asleep, huh? That's what I thought. Monk raised his eyebrows, and considering Michael had his own wheels and a lot of valuable equipment on board, he'd hardly be taking 40 winks in a stranger's truck. I'm afraid that whatever happened to put Michael to sleep has made sure he won't be waking up again. Freddie swirled the vodka around in his glass and swore, cursing Carl fucking Shine and his property developing. He didn't know what the hell was going on in that marshy dump, but he did know that Carl was to blame, and that wasn't acceptable. Monk placed his empty glass on the thick beechwood coffee table. So, what's next, boss? Freddie didn't have to think for long. His anger at Carl was becoming hard to contain.
He took an envelope from his pocket and passed it to Monk. "It would appear that Shine has cost me a good man, a vital man where the other job is concerned. This is for what you've done so far. Now we need the services of Mr. Fabian."
Monk took the money, drew in a long breath, puffed out his cheeks, and nodded.
"I know where I can find him, Mr. Carver. Shall I set up a meeting?"
"Not this time, Monk. You'll be the go-between. I have no wish to be connected in any way to this transaction, understand?"
He jabbed his glass towards Monk.
"Do this discreetly, and it'll be worth your while."
Monk looked worried.
"Fabian likes to know who he's working for, boss. That could be a problem."
"Then fucking sort it, or I'll find someone who will."
He saw the other man's Adam's apple move up and down in his skinny throat.
"Right, Mr. Carver, I'll do it. Don't worry. Is it the usual fee for Fabian?"
"Yes, the usual extortionate fee. Now, meet me here at 7 tonight. I'll have all the information necessary for our friend to do a good job."
Monk nodded and rose from his seat.
7 it is, boss."
Monk hated working with Fabian. That weirdo's methods, although effective, made Monk sick to the stomach. But it would mean big money, and he'd heard about a special shipment arriving next month. The purest of pure, with a massive street value. If he could raise enough to buy into it, he would never need the likes of Freddie Carver again. As he walked back to his car, he considered how he could tackle the sinister Mr. Fabian and set up the hit without involving Freddie. It wouldn't be easy, but he had a fair idea of how he could make it work. Monk unlocked the car and eased himself behind the wheel. Carver might be a slimeball, but one thing was certain: if you did the job right, he paid well, very well. And if he employed a man with Fabian's expertise, the rates were even higher. Monk tapped thoughtfully on the leather steering wheel. Perhaps he should look at this situation differently. After all, there was more than one way to skin a cat, wasn't there? Chapter 10. Yvonne was getting used to the organised chaos in the ITU department. She sat close to the bed where William Pike lay, and while she kept one eye on the sleeping man, watched the professionals at work. It wasn't the kind of job that she would have wanted to do, but she had the highest regard for their expertise and their ability to work so calmly under such high-pressure conditions. She stared at Pike and thought it a bit sad that there was no one to sit with him, no family and no loved ones. He might be a toe rag of the First Order, but for heaven's sake, the kid's heart had stopped the night before. Even when he woke up this time, there would only be a crusty old copper sitting beside his bed. For a moment she almost laughed. Come to think of it, it wouldn't be that different if it were her in the bed. Certainly she had work colleagues, and some of them were her closest friends, but both her parents were dead, and her 2 brothers were married and had moved away. Robin had a Canadian wife, and they lived in Alberta with their children, and Harry now lived and worked with his wife in Bali. Yvonne gave a little sigh. And as she had no partner, there would be no loved one to hold her hand and pray for her recovery. She allowed her mind to wander. There had been someone once, or there nearly had been, but that was a long while ago, and as Yvonne was far too practical to dwell on could-have-beens, or if-onlys, she thought of the one soul who truly loved her. But even Holmes was nearing the end of his full and happy life. She smiled to herself. She had rescued Holmes as a puppy, and now she dog-shared him with her next-door neighbour Ray. Yvonne exercised him, then dropped him off and collected him after her shift had ended, a bit like a canine creche. It was a very satisfactory arrangement, as her neighbour, an elderly retired schoolteacher, was a great dog lover, but couldn't do long walks anymore. So it suited them both, and Holmes got the best of both worlds. He was spoilt rotten and wanted for nothing. But Holmes was close to 15, a very good age for a field spaniel, and the thought of losing him made Yvonne go cold. She and Ray both lived alone in adjoining bungalows, and the dog, albeit deaf as a post and very wobbly, was a big part of both their lives. Almost automatically, Yvonne checked her mobile. She dreaded finding a message from Ray, and she knew that one day soon it would happen. But she smiled and pushed the phone back into her pocket. Not yet. Yvonne glanced back to Pike and saw him stir. Then his eyes closed again, and he snored softly, so she took the time to leaf through her notes on the young man's semi-conscious ramblings. It was all rubbish, of course. Air raids, plane crashes, lights on the fen, fires. But one thing that probably wasn't rubbish was a constant mention of his grandmother. Pike was now restless, moving painfully and moaning softly. His left temple was multicoloured with bruising and decorated with a row of even stitches. The face, one that Yvonne suspected had always been thin, was partly covered with a week's growth of scraggy beard and deeply etched with pain. His mutilated leg, suspended in some kind of metal cage, was thankfully covered by a light sheet. The very distinctive metallic smell of blood still hung around him.
Gran, I'm so sorry.
It sounded like a child's voice, and took Yvonne slightly by surprise. William, can you hear me? The young man's eyes darted around, settling nowhere for long. William, we're trying to find your grandmother. Can you help us? Again, the frightened eyes moved swiftly around the room. Do you know where you are, William? Yvonne tried to make her voice sound soft and compassionate. She did not want to scare the little sod into clamming up on whatever treasures of information were swimming around in his addled brain. We really do need to find your gran. She's missing and we're worried for her safety. Pike made a strange gasping sigh, then said quite clearly, She's dead. Yvonne leaned closer. How'd you know that? I heard her die. Yvonne was confused. What do you mean, you heard her die? The nurses and the doctors. He swallowed noisily. They said she was dead. Yvonne thought for a moment or two, then stood up and went to the nurses' station. Sorry to bother you, but did anyone pass away in here recently? A nurse looked across to her colleague. 2 in the last few days, isn't it, Tina? Yes, old Mrs. Hewitt, early hours of Saturday morning, and a young RTC victim earlier today. Why, officer? Yvonne nodded. It's all right, I think you've answered my question. William Pike must have thought the Hewitt lady was his grandmother. He's still very confused. Sorry to have bothered you. She smiled her thanks and turned to walk away. Poor Mrs. Hewitt, that was a real shame. Yvonne looked over her shoulder. Why? The nurse called Tina tilted her head to one side. Well, she had a massive heart attack, but instead of calling an ambulance, someone brought her into A&E in a car and then left her. All we knew was that her name was Hewitt and she lived in one of the marsh villages. Now she's dead and we can't trace her relatives. Yvonne thought about it. What about social services? Can't they trace her? Tina shrugged. Not so far. Perhaps you can help. We are pretty busy, but give the station a ring if you really can't track her down. OK. And the doctor says we will be moving your patient onto a ward tomorrow. Yvonne thanked her and returned to Pike. Slipping back into the chair, she said, Do you know where Anson Taylor is? Anson will hate me. Probably. Did you steal drugs from him? He'll kill me when he finds me. The voice had risen several decibels. I'll take that as a yes, shall I? And he won't kill you. We are here with you. And besides, Anson seems to have done a runner. Pike looked confused, then started whimpering. My leg. Oh, my leg, the pain. Give me something for the pain. A nurse appeared and checked his charts. OK, William. She turned to Yvonne. I think you'd better leave. We need to sort out some stronger pain relief. She lowered her voice. His leg is still in a very bad way, if you understand. The surgeon will be doing another assessment shortly. She stopped speaking and raised her eyebrows. Yvonne gathered from the look that it was still possible that Pike would require an amputation. She nodded but said, I'll wait outside. The doctor will give him something to make him sleep until the morning. By tomorrow, if there are no more seizures, and as long as he doesn't have to go back to theatre, he should be pretty alert. The nurse accompanied her to the door. Why not leave your questions until then? OK, but our officers will have to keep watch tonight. As she walked back to the car park, she was glad that Pike had started talking sense. No air raids or plane crashes this time, and to mistake a dying old lady for his gran was understandable given his condition. With any luck, by tomorrow he should be able to tell them more. As Yvonne sat in her car and waited for DC Dave Harris to answer his phone, she began to wonder what had caused Pike's mind to hallucinate about air raids of all things. He was far too young to even recognize an air raid siren, but deep in the recesses of her mind, the story was somehow familiar. As she brought Dave Harris up to date, WPC Yvonne Collins started to worry that she was missing something vital. At 7 precisely, Monk entered the side door of the bar. In the room upstairs, Freddie was sitting on one of the 2 sofas. Monk wondered if that glass was soldered to his hand. Have you made contact?
Yes, Mr. Carver. And you told him what exactly?
The fat man got up and, without asking, poured Monk a drink.
That I've been contacted by a client who preferred to remain anonymous, boss. And he accepted that? Of course not, Mr. Carver, so I told him in the strictest confidence that I suspected the client was actually the Dutchman.
Ah, clever.
Fabian has been trying to find a way into that mob for years.
Carver nodded appreciatively.
Very nice, Monk. Very nice.
He picked up a large brown envelope from the table.
Everything you need, my friend, is in here. Photographs, full personal details, and a down payment. And from now on, I want to know nothing until I read about his sad demise in the daily paper, and then you'll both be paid.
He threw the package across the table, and Monk picked it up. It was appreciably heavier than previous down payments. He swallowed his drink and left, his dream of working for himself just a little closer to fruition. By 9 that evening, Carl had decided that he could no longer put off ringing one of the History Society members. He needed answers. It was rumoured that by morning the police would have moved off-site, but he dare not invite Freddie's men back until he was 100% sure that they wouldn't be back for a full search if the need arose. And anyway, it wasn't right that a load of anoraks like Joshua Flower and his geeky friends knew more about his property than he did. It took 3 attempts before one of them offered to meet him at the airfield early the next day and give him a tour. He was almost grateful that it wasn't Joshua, but his brother Simon who had volunteered. At least the slightly younger man wasn't quite such a boring old fart.
There really isn't an awful lot to show you, Mr. Shine, just a couple of things that are not immediately apparent. The thing is, Flaxton Mere was meant to be special, and towards the end of 1944, when Britain...
Carl realised that he'd been wrong about Simon. Immediately bored, he claimed another appointment, thanked the man for his help, verified the time and place of the meeting, and hung up. Jesus, he'd only asked for an hour of the man's time. He didn't want a bloody history lesson. But at least it was all arranged, and afterwards, when he was certain that the Fenland Constabulary had left his land, he would ring Freddie and endeavour to keep him on side until he was sure they wouldn't be coming back. He walked barefoot over the plush carpet of his lounge and headed for the drinks cupboard. As he stretched out his arm to open it, he felt a slight draft on his back. Forgetting the drink, he wandered back into the hall and looked around. There was no sound, and nothing was out of place. He checked the dining room and the study, but again, all was well. The quarry tiles of the kitchen floor felt cold to his feet, and he realised he had not closed the back door properly. He was not usually careless, but he had a lot on his mind at present. Carl shut it and locked it, hearing the levers slip into place, and then went back for his drink. A long hot bath and a single malt was what he needed right now, and nothing was going to stop him. As Carl Shine wallowed in hot, steamy water, with the strains of Coldplay drifting around the house, a dark figure stood in his kitchen. The man, clad in black from ski mask head to leather sports-shoed toe, was looking for a particular item. It took him 2 minutes to locate it, then he quietly slipped through the utility door and into the darkness. Chapter 11. Just after 10, Nikki decided that she really should go home, but Knott Cottage was so cosy and comfortable. She had not expected to have another meal cooked for her, but when she got in from work, Tamsin arrived on her doorstep asking her to join them for supper. "I'm sorry to inflict the veggie bit on you again, but Dad's gone into overdrive." Tamsin had tried to sound indifferent, but Nikki detected a note of pleasure in her voice. "We have enough food to open a vegetarian restaurant." And she hadn't been far wrong, but Nikki knew something that Tamsin didn't. Joseph only cooked on this grand scale when he was stressed, and by the look of the myriad colourful bowls of food that he dished up, right now he was strung out. Even so, the meal had been amazing, and although Tamsin occasionally found the need to make some mildly deprecating comment about her father, Nikki had picked up on a remarkable softening in the girl. And Tamsin seemed to have embraced the hunt for Eve with something bordering on fanaticism. "2 things before you go." Tamsin fished around in one of the old boxes. "I thought you might like to keep this picture separate. It's really too beautiful to be stuffed in a cardboard box and left in an attic." Nikki looked at the photograph and smiled broadly. "I wondered where that one had gone. It used to have pride of place on the mantelpiece when I was younger. It is stunning, isn't it?" The picture was a studio shot and showed a very attractive woman with a mane of auburn hair and the greenest of eyes. She was dressed in a simple cowl-neck sweater in a soft primrose colour. Her smile held just the slightest hint of amusement. "That's my mother," said Nikki softly. "Kathy." Joseph took the photo from her and looked a little perplexed. "Did the hair colour skip a generation?" Nikki laughed softly. "No, Kathy was my father's second wife. My biological mother was killed by a hit-and-run driver shortly after I was born." She stared at the picture. "They never caught the driver, and funnily enough, that was one of the reasons why I decided to join the police force. I wanted to make things better. I didn't want other people to be left with unfinished business and unsolved cases." She smiled at the woman in the picture. "But hell, I'd love to have had that hair." Tamsin passed her a second photograph. "And do you know this woman? Out of that one box of photos, she's the only puzzle." Nikki took the picture and felt a distinctive shiver pass through her, though she had no idea why. She looked closely. "I was going to say that I've never seen her before." She paused. "But I think maybe I have." Nikki let out a long breath. "I was given something today." She still had the book from Glenfield in her handbag. She took it out and passed it to Tamsin. "The writing inside is my father's, but how it came to be in his locker is a mystery, and there is a picture in the back. Take a look at it." Tamsin and Joseph gazed at it eagerly. "It's the same woman," breathed the girl. "So who is she?" "I suspect her name is Eve," said Nikki quietly, "and I'm not sure that I can wait for my father's friend Tug Owen to come up for the funeral." Tamsin stared at the picture. "That man there, he's called Tug." She picked out several of the RAF photos. "Look, I identified him easily. He's in a lot of the shots." "And he's standing right next to the mystery woman in at least 2 of the photos, so he must know her," said Joseph. "Then why did he deny it?" mused Nikki. "He was adamant about it." She frowned. "And I'm loath to challenge him again over the phone. I guess it will have to wait until we see him." Tamsin shrugged. "Maybe she's not Eve. Perhaps we are jumping to conclusions." Nikki looked at them inquiringly. "Would either of you like to place a bet on that?" She looked up. 2 heads were slowly shaking from side to side. "Thought not." PC Tinker and PC Jenkins sat in the car and took it in turns to catnap. There was nothing to see on the dark fen, and boredom had set in hours ago. As Bob Tinker snored softly, Reg Jenkins got out of the vehicle to stretch his legs. The silence out on the marsh was complete. He heard no nightbirds, no rustling of small animals in the undergrowth, and no traffic noises drifting across from the road. There was no moon and no stars that he could see, just a cover of thick cloud, and not for the first time that night, he wondered what the hell they were doing there. It was obvious to him that this had been the clandestine meeting place of dealer and pusher, and after the transaction had taken place, Pike the plonker had fallen arse over elbow down the shaft. End of story. He walked towards the cordoning that stood out dimly in the gloom and stopped. Out towards the marsh, he had seen a light, just a glimmer, then it was gone. He tried to keep his eyes trained on the spot. "Bob, come here, now!" Bob Tinker woke up and ambled across. "What's up?" "I saw something." Reg pointed in the direction of where the light had come from. "In this? How? It's black as hell." "A light, a small point of light, look, there." This time, they both saw it. "Jesus, surely there isn't someone out on the marsh." "No one in their right mind would be out there. The tides cause all manner of bogs and deep water pockets in this part." Bob peered, searching for another sign of life. "What do we do?" Reg felt helpless. No way could they venture onto that soft, marshy terrain at night. "Oh, Lord, look!" A tiny glimmer, no more than a soft lantern-like glow, was dancing out towards the farthest point of Flaxton Mere Fen. Then suddenly, it was joined by another light. Reg's mouth had gone dry. "Poachers, it's their torch beams." "Talk sense, mate. No local would be daft enough to go out on the marsh with no moonlight to guide them." "But they've lived here all their lives. They know these treacherous spots." "And that's why you won't find a poacher out there. Think about it. The tide is about to turn and the ground gets waterlogged quicker than you can run. Believe me, if anyone is out there, they're in big trouble." Bob gathered himself. "I'll get the loudhailer. We'll try to warn them." He ran back to his car, threw open the boot and returned, already shouting a warning across the dark fenland. As his shouts died away, the lights returned. Again Bob's voice bellowed into the night, but the strange lights still danced across the watery land. "Stop." Reg's voice was shaky. "You ever heard of the Will-o'-the-Wisp?" "The jack-o'-lantern? Yes, it's methane gas. Is that what we're looking at?" Bob stared again at the flickering lights. "Dunno. Some say there are corpse candles heralding a death. Then others reckon—" "Oh, fuck, what's that?" "What's what?" Reg gulped, having just frightened himself with talk of corpses. Then he heard it, and there was no denying it was the sound of a laugh. Not a hearty guffaw, but more of a low, throaty chuckle. This time both men retreated to a position close by the car, where they stood rooted to the spot. "Any ideas, Reg? And I mean sensible ones?" Bob's voice held a distinct tremor. Reg opened the driver's door and looked at his crewmate. "Answer me this. Has this weird shit anything to do with why we're stuck out here?" "No." "Will anyone believe us?" "Absolutely not. We'll get told we're no better than old Miss Quinny, a pair of praps who've been spooked by scary stories." "Then get in the car and lock your door. Shift change is in half an hour, and then we're out of here. This never happened, right?" Chapter 12. Carl picked up his bunch of keys from the hall table and pulled on a thick sweater, knowing it would be chilly in the bowels of the derelict buildings. He pushed his cell phone into the pocket of his slacks and quickly looked around before leaving. Finding the back door open the night before had unnerved him. He had even done a recce of his home before he turned in, to check that there was no one concealed in his wardrobe or under his bed, ready to nick his plasma screen as he slept. Now, in the light of day, he laughed at himself. Tiptoeing around, opening cupboard doors and peering under beds. What a plank! He looked at his watch and saw it was time to go. The old wallet of Flaxton-Mere keys was still in the glove compartment of the car, so, with a last glance around, Shine went out through the utility door and into the gloom of the double integral garage. He pressed the remote button on his car key and saw the BMW's lights flash. He opened the driver's door and slipped in comfortably behind the leather steering wheel. Although he would never admit it, the latent schoolboy in him was quite looking forward to this adventure, even if it had to be in the company of a zealot. He reached forward to activate the electronic garage door system, and gagged loudly as a terrible force squeezed his windpipe. Both his hands flew up to his oxygen-starved throat and ineffectually tore at whatever was exerting that bone-crushing pressure. Apart from the fear at the realization that air passages and blood vessels were closing down on him, there was a roaring noise in his ears that filled his whole pain-racked world. His ability to move was failing, although in his attempt to free his airway, he was still just about able to register a fingernail tearing from its bed. His body was rigid, but his legs thrashed against the car. Then, as his protruding tongue seemed to swell to an impossible size, a welcome blackness descended over him. Monk stood in his backyard and hoped the smoke from the incinerator would not draw attention to what he was doing. If his plan went well, he would soon be moving from this grim part of town and into something more suited to his tastes. His rent was paid up for another 3 months. By the time it was due again, he would have invested his money from Freddie, sold on his share of the shipment, and be ready, willing and able, to change his lifestyle. Not that he wanted too much change. He liked living alone. In his line of work, you didn't need someone watching your every move, and if he were honest with himself, he didn't like sharing his money. Women were a drain on resources, so when he needed a bit of carnal satisfaction, it was easier to buy it. It was worth it not to have a woman nagging him to decorate or to take her shopping. As the fire died down, he threw in the information and photographs that Freddie Carver had given him. Carl Shine's smiling face blackened and bubbled, then curled into strange tortured shapes before succumbing to the heat. He prodded the glowing ashes with an old hoe, mixing and turning until nothing recognizable was left. It had been so easy, just a little bit of careful thought, and job done. And he had Fabian's cut as well as his own. Freddie would be well pleased. That fat git had no time for procrastinators. Speed and efficiency was what he liked, and you only got one chance with Freddie. One mistake, and you were off the payroll, one way or another. Monk placed the lid on the galvanized bin and walked away. Depending on how long it took for Shine to be discovered, he would soon be making one last visit to Freddie to collect those well-earned wages. Nikki flopped down at her desk and switched on her computer. She had checked with uniform, and there was no word on the streets about Anson Taylor, and with Pike still sedated, she was at an impasse. She had just begun reading through the reports from the night before when the phone rang and she heard Joseph's voice.
Tam and I have just uncovered a pretty weird coincidence in one of these boxes of your father's, Nikki. But we don't believe in coincidences, do we? We don't, but it can't be anything else. Nikki heard the rustling of paper. Then Joseph said, Your father has some papers in a leather folder. They look a bit official, but as you'd say, it was okay. Get on with it, Joseph. They refer to RAF Flaxton Mere. Nikki sat bolt upright. What? He was never based locally, and Flaxton is a Second World War station. Dad flew Harrier jump jets for heaven's sake, and I can't see too many of them taken off from that dump. We can't make sense of it, Nikki, but there is also a memo. It's some kind of contact details, and there's a name at the bottom, someone called Eve Anderson.
Eve, whispered Nikki. Now why do I feel so uncomfortable that she's connected in some way to that scary bloody airfield?
There was a pause. We feel the same. I get the feeling that there is more to that place than we know about. Tamsin is going to start checking the internet. Luckily, she's shit-hot with a keyboard. Nikki's eyes narrowed. That's great, but as soon as I've sorted things out here, I'm going to get hold of that History Society, and we'll go there ourselves. Uniform said they were happy to help, and that they know the place better than anyone else, including the owner, so I want the full tour with nothing held back. Want to come? Joseph spoke softly to his daughter, then said, Okay, what time? I'll collar one of the historians and get back to you. Nikki saw Joseph's car already parked on an area of concrete hard standing close to the old watchtower. Next to him was a small battered Renault Clio and a flashy vintage motorbike. As she locked the car, she saw that Joseph and his daughter were in conversation with a grey-haired, eccentric-looking man, and that there were 3 other men beside the little Clio, all chatting animatedly. Great, she murmured to herself, a bloody coach party. As she walked towards them, one of the men stepped forward. He seemed familiar in some way. He could have been anything from 40 to 50 plus. His dress was sporty casual, and his greying hair was thick and wavy, although neatly cut with a floppy fringe and a side parting. And there was a twinkle in his eye that made him look quite boyish, whatever his true age. I know you, she said bluntly. The man stuck out a hand and grinned at her. And I know you, dear Galena. We've been on more than one shout together, from different sides of the emergency services, of course. Nikki concentrated her thoughts for a moment, then said, Ah, Blue Watch, you're a firefighter. Spot on. Simon Flower, brother to that old windbag over there. He pointed fondly towards the grey-haired man, who Nikki now knew to be Joshua Flower. But although I'm still with the fire department, I'm an investigator now. And an aficionado of desolate and dreary derelict airfields. No, you're referring to my brother. He laughed and the eyes sparkled, and generally this place would not interest me one iota, but it does have a fascinating history, and a few surprises, too. Nikki frowned. Like what? Simon Flower's smile broadened, and Nikki couldn't help but notice that he was extremely attractive, considering his probable age and the dangerous kind of work that he'd done. I'd better leave that to my brother to explain. This place is his baby. He pointed in Joshua's direction. Come on, let me introduce you to the history boys. Simon did the honours, and Nikki found herself surrounded by eager faces and names that she recognised from the list provided earlier by Uniform. Before we go into the buildings, Professor Flower, what can you tell us briefly about this particular station? Joshua took a deep breath, then said, Well, it was originally a fighter station with grass landing strips, but it was brought up to date in the 1940s with the typical A-plan concrete runways and dispersal pans for heavier bombers. As you can see, they scattered the hangars, sheds, stores and defences well away from the main control room, which was damn sensible because if one got hit, at least the others wouldn't go up with it. Nikki noticed that Joseph was staring at Joshua Flower and listening with real interest. Even she realised that he was not the crumbly old bore they had expected, and although the man was passionate about World War II history, he explained everything in a manner that held their attention. He was certainly eccentric, but compared with some of the dry-as-dust academic speakers that Nikki had suffered in the past, Flower could almost be considered a ray of sunshine. He had a kind of charisma that drew you in and held you there. Well, other than the stuff you posted yourself, there is nothing much about it on the internet, said Tamsin, unlike some of the other stations, where there are pages of information. Just so, young lady, and that's because this place is something of an enigma. He tapped the side of his nose conspiratorially. It has secrets. Flower smiled cryptically. Oh, yes, it has a long history, but I'll make it simple.
Originally, the RAF decided to turn it from a small fighter station into what was called a decoy site to protect some of the larger fields. It was to have dummy planes and landing lights, and they even planned to spray the ground to make it look like an A-plan runway. But when they looked closely at the location and the land available, they changed their minds. Initially, they had believed the land to be too low and silty and too close to the marsh to be safe, but ground studies showed that the site was higher and far more stable than first thought. So they allowed the dummy rumour to spread. But, in reality, they began to construct a major airfield. He glanced around at his entranced audience. And there is a wonderfully preserved area beneath the main control room. We discovered it when we began researching and mapping the place for historical reference. It is almost as if it was during the war, only the paraphernalia that would have been there is gone. It's one of the reasons that we want to preserve it, chipped in a man named Selby. There are very few places left in such incredibly good order. It would be absolute sacrilege to destroy it. And the owner wants to do that? Asked Joseph. He says he wants to restore it, Detective, but we believe otherwise. We know he already has plans to build prestige housing, and we also know that once he begins, he'll want more and more, and our old historical military buildings will go under the wrecker's ball. Can he do that? Asked Tamsin. He owns the land. He can do whatever he wants. There is no protection order at Flaxton Mere. He could rip it to shreds any time he wanted. Joseph nodded. And what do you know about him? Carl Shine, not a lot, although we try to keep him sweet because he allows us access. He has no objection to us researching the place, and he lets us come and go pretty much as we wish. He's even given us keys for the padlocks. Flowers shrugged. But that could change very quickly when he starts his project. That's why our group is fighting to get something legal in place to protect the watch office, the control room, and the bunker, said Selby vehemently, and fast. By the way, as you just mentioned, Shine, Simon interjected. He was on the blower last night ringing round some of the club members to try and get a guided tour. He insisted that it had to be this morning, so as I was free I came out on the bike, but the silly sod didn't turn up. Did you ring him? There was no answer, just a recorded message. Funny, murmured Nikki to Joseph. Uniform said that Shine's red BMW has been out here from dawn till dusk since Pike's accident, but the car's certainly not here now, is it? Something must have cropped up, or maybe he just forgot, said Joseph doubtfully. Nikki felt a niggle of concern and decided to try to contact the man herself as soon as their trip was over. Don't be surprised if some more of the society turn up, Detective Inspector. As soon as any of the guys know we're coming out here, they usually tag along. It's such a fascinating place, it attracts them like moths to a flame. Joshua's smile and obvious fervour for his subject made it difficult to be angry, and Nikki decided that perhaps it wouldn't be a bad thing to know who else had an interest in this godforsaken junkyard. So, where do we start? Right here in the watchtower, but first hard hats and battery lanterns for everyone. He opened his boot and took out a large cardboard box. Then he turned to Nikki. We do have a certain amount of lighting down there, in the form of big colour lamps, but there are unlit passages and we need to keep safe. He looked around at his troop and smiled. All kitted out? Then follow me. Prior to going inside, Nikki had no idea of what an old airbase would look like. Sure, they littered the Lincolnshire countryside, but their numbers were declining fast, and they were either being demolished or just disintegrating. So she was not prepared for the size of the place or what existed beneath the ground. Simply amazing, isn't it? Joshua's excited voice echoed around them. The idea was that they would command the skies from below the earth. He waved a hand towards the massive underground room that stretched out ahead of them. Walk with me, and I'll tell you about Flaxton Mere's well-kept secret. He moved through the big room in the direction of a wide passageway. During the war, it was believed that a German invasion was very much on the cards. RAF Flaxton Mere, because of its location and numerous other considerations, was chosen to be what we would now call a super airfield. The professor cleared his throat, then continued. Considerable work was started to construct 4 separate strike-proof bunkers, one for high-ranking personnel, one to house a state-of-the-art communication center, one for the servicemen and women, and one massive area that would serve as a depot for vehicles, armoured cars, and the like. Apart from the bunkers, there would have been storerooms, bomb stores, and a multitude of other installations. Flaxton Mere was to have been the nerve centre that would control all the surrounding airfields from Lincoln to Cambridge. Joseph let out a long, low whistle. That's some installation, especially considering there are very few underground facilities of any kind in this county because of the soft fenland soil.
This site is very rare, a complete anomaly. The soils are complex in their structure. It seems that there was once a monastery here, built on what was then a ridge, an area of high ground some way from the marshes. The wetlands have now encroached, and the terrible storms have altered the coastline completely.
Joshua shook his head.
And one day soon, I'm sure it will surrender to the flood.
He exhaled.
But I digress. Back to the war. It soon became clear that the invasion would never happen, and this superstation would not be required. Work stopped. The private contractors who had been brought in from far and wide were sworn to secrecy, then disbanded. So, as the RAF had taken great pains to keep everything very much under wraps, it didn't take too long for people to forget it ever existed. If it hadn't been for the collective memories of the History Society, we would never have uncovered all this.
The professor explained that sadly little was left.
This is the only intact bunker, the one designed as a control room, although there are numerous underground stores and passages. We've been mapping them for years.
And it's all structurally safe? Asked Joseph.
The tunnels and chambers that we use are fine. You met my brother Simon, and as you know, he is a fire investigation and safety officer. He has checked the underground areas personally. We have no wish to lose anyone through negligence, I assure you.
As they continued into a wide tunnel, Nikki walked along beside Joshua, Selby and Joseph, and she began to feel the atmosphere of RAF Flaxton Mere at a time of war. She saw in her mind's eye uniformed men and women hurrying down the long corridors, opening heavy metal-framed doors, papers tucked beneath their arms and gas masks slung over one shoulder. She saw pallets stacked high with great gleaming shell cases being carefully moved from stores to loading bays, and she imagined the awareness that at any moment enemy bombers could make a lucky strike, and this bunker would become a sealed tomb. Nikki was usually not fanciful, but this odd place and the sound of Joshua's hypnotic voice explaining what had gone on so many years ago made her feel strange, as if she had slipped out of her own time zone and fallen back into the 1940s. As they walked through the main control room and down a long, straight corridor to what was left of a massive underground storeroom, Nikki felt certain that this was not the only part left undamaged. Yes, some of it would have succumbed to the passing of time, but she was convinced that there was more than this.
You said that you've been mapping the area, Professor Flower. Do you have those maps with you? They're on our computer, Inspector, but I've asked Andrew Fryer, another of our number, to print them off for you. They are by no means conclusive, but they are an indication of the original infrastructure, and we do have some old plans on record, although they bear little resemblance to what is left today.
He looked at his watch.
With any luck, Andrew will be here by the time we surface.
Where's Tamsin? Asked Nikki, looking around.
She's taken a different route, with Simon and Frank Kohler.
Joshua smiled reassuringly.
And she's in safe hands. Those two know every inch of this place.
To see what?
Storage cellars, map rooms, all much smaller than the main bunker, but interesting nevertheless.
He paused.
Oh, and there is one little surprise.
He nodded to himself.
Simon is probably showing Miss Easter the secret tunnel he found last year.
Before Joshua could continue, Nikki heard the sound of running footsteps. She looked around and was surprised to see a familiar figure racing up behind them.
Dave?
Mom! Dave Harris, out of breath and wide-eyed at the strange location in which he had found himself, caught them up.
I need a word. It's urgent.
She led him away from the others, noting his worried expression.
I've been asked to get you all out of here, to evacuate these premises and get everyone to the main car park.
Nikki stiffened. What's happened?
We need to seal off the area, Mum. The body of Carl Shine has just been found, and he didn't croak through natural causes. So considering all the other factors, like the guy down the shaft and the drugs and so on...
Dave left the sentence unfinished. Nikki nodded.
Then we need to get everyone out. We could be trampling vital evidence underfoot.
She turned back to Joshua.
I'm sorry, sir, but you need to get your friends out of here. There has been an incident that we believe is connected to this place. We need to clear the area to protect any evidence. Where are the others?
The two historians looked at each other with troubled expressions. Then Joshua grabbed Selby's arm and said,
You take the other officers to the passage where Simon will be, and I'll make sure none of the others have followed us down here.
Selby nodded.
Nikki added, Dave, go with the professor and make sure no one else comes in.
Selby beckoned to them.
Come with me."
He turned, and with an unusual loping gait, went back down the corridor and opened a small door. His large battery-powered lantern showed a shadowy passage stretching off in front of them. Their footsteps sounded strangely muffled as they half ran through what seemed an endless corridor linking storage rooms and cellars. Nikki tried to remember the route, but as they circumnavigated old shelving units and benches, piles of broken furniture, and in one place a stack of what looked like empty fuel drums, she knew that she was hopelessly lost.
"Not much further."
Selby sounded out of breath.
"We'll go through the east chamber."
He indicated an opening that led down a long, wide passageway. "This place is a maze."
"You haven't seen the half of it, Inspector."
Selby's eyes glittered in the torchlight.
"Then why did the Professor just tell us that there was little left other than the main bunker, a few stores and the corridors?"
asked Joseph edgily.
"We don't generally tell anyone about this place. We need to get our preservation order on it before the size and importance of Flaxton Mere is made public."
They were entering a small empty chamber, with one rotting wooden door that was wedged open. The damp smell that oozed from the tunnel made Nikki think of ancient crypts and abandoned cellars.
"Simon, Frank, come back. It's urgent."
Selby's voice echoed down the tunnel.
"Damn, this passage goes on for miles. They're obviously out of earshot." "Does it have another exit?" asked Joseph, clearly anxious that two strange men had taken his daughter off into the middle of nowhere.
"No."
Selby shone his torch along shiny, moss-covered walls.
"It did once. It was an escape route in case the enemy infiltrated the bunkers, or if there was a fire or an emergency. The exits were sealed up at some point, which, with the marsh water rising much higher now, is a blessing."
"Then why the hell has Simon Flower taken my daughter down a dark, stinking tunnel that goes nowhere?"
Joseph's anger was filled with concern.
"Because it is a bit of an enigma, and please don't worry. Simon and Frank know this place as well as I do. Tamsin will be quite safe with them, I assure you."
"Sir, we have a job to do," butted in Nikki. "Could we just locate Tamsin and the others and get everyone out of here?"
From behind them, Nikki heard more footsteps, and in the torchlight, Nikki saw Joshua Flower hurrying towards them.
"Everyone is out and accounted for, with the exception of those three."
"Then let's go,"
said Joseph impatiently, moving towards the damp passageway.
"Let me."
Marcus Selby spoke up.
"It's pointless us all trooping down there. It's narrow, and I know it well, so I'll be quicker."
In seconds, the beam of his flashlight could be seen disappearing into the tunnel.
"What did Selby mean by an enigma?"
Joseph remained staring along the tunnel. Joshua Flower did not answer immediately. Then he switched off his own torch to save the batteries.
"I suppose if we are going to have half the Fenton Constabulary down here poking about, you will need to know our secrets."
"Every last one of them, Professor," said Nikki coldly.
"I was afraid that might be the case."
"Forgive me for asking, but why should this ghastly and probably very dangerous wreck hold secrets that you wish to guard so jealously?"
Nikki squatted down on her haunches, her back to the cold wall.
"History. Precious history."
He sighed.
"This place is unique. It could have meant the difference between keeping our warplanes flying or losing them to the Luftwaffe. Our group has spent years trying to uncover the true history of this amazing piece of our heritage, and suddenly it is being threatened by man and nature simultaneously."
"And the enigma of this particular tunnel?"
"Ah, yes. We are unsure as to whether this route was constructed by luck or design, but it follows a much older system that was in existence long before the war. Remember I mentioned the monastery? This ground belonged to the church. Records show not only a monastery, but a very ancient place of worship even prior to that."
He drew in a deep breath.
"And the monks, it seems, were not averse to a spot of smuggling. This tunnel led from the monastery out into the marsh, where they had constructed a series of bolt holes, man-made caves, where contraband was stored, to be either moved on for sale or brought in from boats out in the wash and up to the church."
Joshua's voice worked its magic, and Nikki found she was interested despite her concern for Tamsin.
"At intervals along this tunnel, there are small circular chambers. Some were used as storerooms for the monks' booty, others were portals that led up to the caves, and one was actually a tiny chapel. We believe that for all their illegal doings, they did not want to miss their devotions, so if a couple of brothers were working in the tunnel and the bell rang, they would still have somewhere to worship."
"And the chapel is still there?"
asked Joseph, not taking his eyes from the tunnel.
Flower said,
Yes, although it's a little more than a 6x6 hall with a small semicircular recess in the wall with an ancient crucifix standing in it. Nikki whistled softly, then dragged her mind back to the investigation. Can we rely on your help to search this place properly? We have already offered, when that unfortunate boy fell down the shaft. I know, but I get the feeling we would only have been shown the parts that you wanted us to see. In fact, she threw the man a knowing glance. I suspect your intentions were to keep us away from your precious tunnels. Joshua let out a small sigh. I confess, Inspector, that is the truth of it. Where the hell is Selby? Joseph moved forward and shone his light down the passageway. He's been gone for ages. He's coming. Listen. A moment later, Selby emerged into the dancing light of their torch beams. I don't understand it. They're not there. The tunnel is empty. Half an hour later, surrounded by police cars, vans, and assorted personnel, Nikki, Joseph, and Dave Harris stood with 4 grim-faced members of the history group. Mr. Brewer, you and your wife arrived just after we went down into the bunker. You spoke to Simon Flower and Frank Kohler. Bill Brewer was in his 60s and looked like one of the experts from Bargain Hunt. He wore an old but well-cared-for 3-piece suit, complete with gold watch chain, a fresh flower in his lapel, and polished black boots. He nodded vigorously. Yes, Simon asked if we wanted to go into the marsh tunnel. That's right, officer, added Margaret Brewer, his rotund wife. But we've been mapping one of the old stores, and we wanted to get on with that. OK, then no more messing around. It's time to get a full search underway. Nikki gritted her teeth. Have you guys got any idea where else they might have gone? The Brewers, Selby, and Flower shook their heads. There is nowhere else of interest that is safe, and Simon would not risk anything happening to anyone. Nikki had a sinking feeling in her stomach about the truth of that statement. She covered her concern with a slightly accusatory belligerence. You people should never have been allowed on this site. It's a bloody death trap. She was going to say more when she caught a warning glance from Joseph. Better not to antagonize the one group of people who could prove useful in a proper search. Right, well, I have to ask you all to stay here until I can get an officer to take your details. A uniformed officer and a couple of anxious-looking constables approached her. Get the teams ready, Sergeant. We have a big area to cover before twilight. Before he could reply, Dave's voice rang out. Hey, Mom, look! From the far edge of the marsh, 3 figures were making their way towards them. Thank God, it's Tamsin. The relief in Joseph's voice was palpable. And Simon and Frank, added Joshua Flower. But where on earth? Hi, Dad. What's this all about? Tamsin looked puzzled. Joseph was ashen. It was nearly a major manhunt for the 3 of you. Nikki interrupted. We were told you were in a bloody tunnel, so what the hell were you doing out there? We were in a tunnel, Simon said excitedly, but there had been a small landslip, and it revealed another way out to the fen. We've been looking for it for years. Simon thinks it was used by smugglers, added Tamsin, clearly unfazed by her adventure. Then she looked around and took in the flashing blue lights and uniformed officers. Oh, shit. Dad, please tell me all this is not because we went exploring. Nikki drew in a deep breath and said, Relax, Tamsin. At least you're safe. Now I can turn this over to uniform to secure the area. She beckoned to Joseph and lowered her voice. Get Tamsin out of here. I have to go back to the station and set up a murder room, but I'll ring you later with an update. Joseph nodded, then whispered, I'm going to cancel my leave. You'll need me. Wait until we know the facts about Carl Shine's death. Don't forget, you have Tamsin to consider. You can't leave her stuck out on Cloud Fen. It's too bloody dangerous. Nikki touched his arm lightly. In the meantime, work on that link between Eve, my father, and this hellhole. It's really worrying me. Now go. I'll ring you later. Chapter 13. Oh my. Professor Rory Wilkinson, the Home Office pathologist, leant over his latest acquisition and exclaimed, Whoever wanted you dead, my friend, certainly made sure of it. He pushed his wireframe glasses further up the bridge of his nose and looked more closely at the mortal remains of Carl Shine. Looks pretty straightforward to me. One of the mortuary technicians was carefully removing Carl's clothing. Well, now, Matthew, you say that, but there are such secrets within this treasure chest of a body. What we see on the surface makes your assumption seem correct, but beneath the skin... He waved a slender hand in the air.
Who knows?
Matt shrugged as he carefully laid out the clothes on another table. Whatever you say, Prof, but I still think it's an open and shut case.
Rory gave his assistant a withering look. Very droll. Now, if you'd be kind enough to measure and weigh this gentleman, we can get the external examination out of the way, and then the master will do what the master does best.
I don't know how you can be so passionate about slicing up dead people, said Matt flatly.
Sometimes I despair of you, young man. Now, come here.
The tall forensic scientist pointed to the body on the steel table.
Behold, all the complexities of the universe are contained within the intricate composition of this human body, and you, Matthew, are one of the privileged few who get to see that miracle with your own eyes.
All that says maybe, but at the end of the day it's still slicing up dead people.
Rory raised his eyes heavenwards. Dear Lord, forgive me for asking, but if it's not too much trouble, could my next technician have a soul, please?
Matthew, well used to the pathologist waxing lyrical over his cadavers, adjusted the microphone above the table and stood back. If I were you, I'd just settle for one with a strong stomach.
Rory knew when he was beaten. Beggars can't be choosers, I suppose. Let's begin. File number 4725. Carl Daniel Shine. Here we have the body of a well-nourished 35-year-old white male. His weight is...
Later, as Matt began cleaning up and preparing for their next silent guest, Rory Wilkinson checked over the detailed description of the injuries sustained by the deceased. It was well known that a killer who chose strangulation as his method of dispatch usually used far more force than was actually necessary. In this case, having studied the body in situ, it was clear that the assailant had been concealed in the back of the car, and when Shine was seated, had thrown a length of nylon tow rope over his head and yanked it backwards with more than considerable force.
Enough to practically behead the poor sod,
muttered Rory. The killer had crossed the rope behind the driver's headrest and simply hung on until his victim was asphyxiated. Amazing, thought the pathologist. The murderer strangled him most effectively, but never once touched him. Can I take a break now, Prof?
Certainly. Bring me back a Kit Kat when you come, will you?
Sure. Oh, and congratulations on your discovery, boss. I now see your point about not assuming too much.
Rory laughed. Even I did not expect that little gem, Matthew.
The young man left, leaving Rory to mull over the paradox. Someone had gone to great lengths to kill Carl Shine. They had risked being convicted of murder and incarcerated for life when, if they had allowed the apparently fit and healthy Mr. Shine to live, he would have died of natural causes in a matter of weeks. At the base of Carl Shine's brain, in an area called the Circle of Willis, Rory had found a berry-like swelling. The aneurysm was at a branching point of an artery, and the weakness was such that it could have ruptured at any moment. The subarachnoid hemorrhage that would have followed would doubtless have proved fatal. It was indeed remarkable that it had not burst during his death throes. This would make jolly good reading in the case file. He hoped Galena would appreciate the irony as she hunted for the perpetrator of such a pointless killing.
Funny old world,
thought Rory, as he checked to see who was next. In the newly instated murder room, Nikki stared at the whiteboard that covered a large part of the far wall. There was not much on it yet, but in a matter of hours it would depict a full-blown case. There would be names, locations, victims, suspects, and photographs. A few days ago, she had found the blank surface irritating. She liked to be busy and had wanted a case to work on. Well, now she had one. At the top of the board was an A4-size photograph of Carl Shine. Next to it was one of Shine in his car that the police photographer had taken. It was difficult to believe that they were the same person. In the first, he was looking directly into the camera, slightly tanned, with smartly cut hair and a satisfied grin on his face. In the second, his face and neck were swollen, the skin a purplish colour, with pinpoint hemorrhages around the eyes. His throat was badly damaged, and an almost horizontal ligature mark cut deep into the flesh. Even without the forensic report, bright blue fibres from the tow rope could clearly be seen protruding from the scorched skin. Nikki stood up and looked at the room full of officers. "Sorry, I know it's getting towards the end of the day, but I want to make sure we all know what we're dealing with." She pointed to the photograph.
This is Carl Daniel Shine, 35 years old, single, lived alone in Martin Park, Greenborough, murdered in his car, a red BMW, which was parked in his integral garage at around 8:30 this morning. We obviously haven't got the pathologist report yet, but as you can see, he was strangled, apparently by a person concealed in the back of the car. A set of spare keys were left on the back seat, so we assume the killer stole them earlier and locked himself in the car to wait for Shine. She paused and looked across to where Kat sat. What have you and Dave dug up on this man? Kat flipped through her notebook. Not a lot more than we had before, Mum. Seems to have been a bit of a loner. The house is mortgaged to the hilt, but it's worth a lot on the market. I've yet to discover how he made his money. There is no visible source of income, but his lifestyle was pretty comfortable. He purchased the old Flaxton Mere airfield from the RAF about 3 years ago, but has pretty well sat on it ever since. I've got hold of his solicitor, who I have to say is not an happy man. If he mentioned the word procrastination once, he mentioned it a dozen times. I'm seeing him at 6 tonight to talk to him about what intentions Shine had for the airfield. Other than that, I've hit a big fat 0. Parents? Sorry, but they are part of the 0 I just mentioned. And you, Dave, anything? Nothing specific, Mum. I've found nothing under Carl Shine on the police computer. In fact, all of his business dealings look clean, but... Dave rubbed at his forehead. I was on a case about 5 or 6 years ago, and we had our eye on a bloke called Daniel Shire. We never actually nailed him for anything, but he kept turning up in our investigations. I reckon it's the same man. What sort of investigations? Nikki asked with interest. Fraud, deception, and money laundering. Then check this Daniel Shire out, Dave, and while Kat is investigating his finances, see what else you can find out about our victim's private life. Yvonne and Niall, you two stay with the William Pike and Anson Taylor area of the inquiry. I want to know if there was any connection, no matter how tenuous, between either of them and Carl Shine. Now. Nikki stared at them, her face hard. I'm certain that Flaxton Mere is the key to everything. Shine owned it. Pike was found with a bag full of drugs on it. Taylor went missing presumably on his way to it. Pike's missing grandmother lives close to it. Are we all agreed so far? There was a murmur of assent, and Nikki continued. With that in mind, I've already got a team out at the airfield, but the super is very concerned about safety issues. Flaxton Mere is hazardous in the extreme. Dave wholeheartedly agreed. Especially if you aren't familiar with it, Mum. Can I suggest we involve the History Society and their maps and plans right from the word go? Nikki nodded. I agree we need them, but the uniforms must do a sweep first. Then at first light we'll engage our history boys and go in ourselves. Right now, go home and get your beauty sleep. We have an early start in the morning. Carl Shine's murder made the 10 o'clock news, making Monk a very happy man. He rang his boss's mobile number and asked if he could meet with him the next day. As he had hoped, it was to be the usual place at 11, and Freddie sounded in very good spirits. And so he should. It had been an efficient and professional hit, just the kind Fat Man Carver liked. Chapter 14. A thin mist was still burning off the marsh, giving the watery landscape the unreal quality of a film set. Nikki half expected to see men in jeans and T-shirts moving the dry ice machine around. Our mates found sod all then. Dave looked weary, and he stifled a yawn. I was half hoping they'd find something so we could skip this early morning jaunt. No such luck. I see the others are already here, and our historical helpers are on their way. Nikki watched as 2 cars and a motorcycle pulled into the parking area. Kat ambled across to them. Morning, Mum. Morning, Dave. She looked back to where the History Society people were getting out of their cars and sighed. Oh, boy, this should be fun. Nikki agreed. She hated using members of the public, no matter how well-meaning they were. In general, they were as useful as a chocolate poker, but as the police knew sod all about the airfield, she was forced to admit that this time they might actually be helpful. She nodded politely to the 5 men, then began allotting areas to be searched. For hours they trudged through the debris and wreckage of the main buildings and storerooms. The dust and grime stuck to their shoes, and the depressing atmosphere clung to their spirits. Peering into a shallow recess off a long corridor beneath the watchtower, Nikki was haunted by the thought that her father might have walked this very route alongside a woman called Eve. When her radio crackled into life, her father's mysterious life was temporarily forgotten.
The reception was poor, and she knew that the further underground she went, the worse it would get. She listened carefully and realized that Cat Cullen's group had made some kind of discovery. They had located an exterior storehouse with footprints leading to it, and as it was nowhere near the area visited by the historians, Cat suspected they might have discovered Pike's reason for being on the fen. A residue of white powder found on a shelf indicated a possible hiding place for a stash of drugs. Nice one, thought Nikki. Forensics would get a match on the sole markings and the dust on the floor, and it was highly unlikely that the deposits were icing sugar. For another hour they combed the buildings, and then Nikki decided to call everyone back to the rendezvous point. Apart from the footprints, they had found nothing.
Seems that's it.
Nikki stared down at the line of ticks on her search list.
Should we check the pillboxes around the perimeter?
Asked Niall.
Don't see much point.
Dave brushed a smudge of limey whitewash from his jacket.
If there's nothing of import in the main buildings, I doubt we'll find anything out there.
Nikki wanted to agree, but said,
We're here now, and as we have the help of these good people,
she indicated the group of civilians,
let's do it properly.
Marcus Selby took a tentative step forward.
I think your sergeant is probably right, Inspector. Those pillboxes are just smelly little concrete huts.
Nikki thought about this, then said,
No, they need checking. Niall and Yvonne, see to that before you return to the station.
Joshua Flower raised a hand.
I'll go with them. I'm in no hurry to get away, even though I'm sure Marcus is perfectly correct.
Nikki thanked their guides and said that she was satisfied that Flaxton Mere held nothing that was of use to them in the hunt for Carl Shine's killer. Then, as they walked away, she wondered if that were true. As she picked her way through the rubble of a collapsed wall, Yvonne decided that, sunny day or not, this miserable place was giving her the shivers, and she would be very glad to be back in her police car and speeding towards the Nick. The first pillbox was some way off, and Joshua Flower fell into step beside her.
I get the feeling that you'd rather be somewhere else, officer.
Make that anywhere else, sir, answered Yvonne grimly. She looked at the older man with interest. Unlike you, I think.
We are all different, aren't we? Under normal circumstances, I couldn't be happier out here.
I know that you're local, sir, but what's your profession? Inquired Yvonne.
I retired early, my dear. My time is my own, which I admit is something of a relief. I was an architect. I did not like working to deadlines, so I started lecturing on the subject, but I couldn't take to university life either. Now the peace and quiet of being able to do as I please is most agreeable to me.
And is there a Mrs. Flower?
No, sadly there isn't.
Flower shrugged.
Married life isn't for everyone, I suppose.
Yvonne silently agreed, then said,
I'm sorry, Professor. I think it's a job. I'm too nosy for my own good.
She changed the subject.
I'm not surprised you were a lecturer, sir. You have a wonderful way of speaking. So where does the interest in airfields come from?
The professor held back a bramble.
This county is jam-packed full of them, and with my love of architecture and history, it just happened organically.
And Simon, he's with the fire service, isn't he? What got him into all this?
He drifted along after me, and he loves the place because he's a born explorer.
He looked up at the clear blue sky, an almost wistful look on his face.
He was studying history, but gave up and helped our father for a while. Then he went into the army. He was in the Royal Engineers and abroad most of the time, but I think he missed home. When he came out, he joined the fire service. That suited him much better.
I don't think our paths ever crossed. Was he a full-time fire officer?
Oh, yes, he was with Boston's Blue Watch up until about 5 years ago, and then the poor blighter developed a severe chest condition. He's still with the service, but as you already know, he's involved with fire investigations and safety issues now.
Yvonne was just about to ask more when she saw Niall beckoning to them.
I see what your mate meant about Stinky, Professor.
The older man nodded.
I doubt we'll find any useful clues around here.
They moved on, walking carefully around the perimeter, checking the uneven ground as they went, parting tufts of thick, coarse grass and holding back vicious blackberry branches with sticks in order to peer into shadowy clumps of overgrowth.
Last one.
Yvonne looked at the ugly structure in front of her.
Allow me to spare your dainty nostrils, said Niall gallantly. I'll go it alone.
He bent down and ducked under the concrete lintel.
Oh, smashing, His voice echoed. "You two don't know what you're missing." "I know only too well, and I doubt you'll need to spend too long in there, PC Farrow. Once you've seen one, you've seen them all." The professor was peering into the opening. Niall asked, "Why's this one got a great lump of concrete in the middle?" "They sometimes put a solid structure like a brick or stone wall in the centre. The idea was that if a grenade or a shot entered via the loophole, it wouldn't ricochet around inside and wipe out the entire garrison. That other heavy mount near the front gun port was the mounting for the main gun, probably a Hotchkiss 6-pounder. Those other smaller lintels by the remaining loopholes were for light machine guns." Yvonne noticed that the man's voice still had a professional tone. He couldn't help delivering a lecture. "Doesn't matter how far off the beaten track you go." Niall was still muttering. "The bleeding lager lads will still find somewhere like this to use as a toilet." "Ouch! Bugger!" The exclamation was followed by a clatter and another oath. Yvonne stifled a laugh. "Are you all right in there?" "Bang my bloody head, drop my bloody torch, and now I've cracked my bloody elbow on one of your bloody machine gun ports." Niall struggled out of the low entrance and brushed himself down. "Sorry about that." This was to Joshua, but I pity the poor sods that had to get in there to protect the realm. Yvonne reached across and rubbed at a dusty patch on her partner's shoulder. "But nothing of interest?" Niall went quiet for a moment, then shook his head. "Nah, nothing except some general crud and something sticky that I would prefer not to talk about." He looked across to the lone police car keeping watch on the sea bank. "Time to give up, I guess." At 10 o'clock, Monk called in to a local estate agent and browsed their properties for sale boards. He didn't know exactly how well he would do on this deal, but he enjoyed the window shopping. There was a smart 2-bedroom bachelor apartment ready in 2 months in a new build on Greenborough's Granary Wharf. Very modern, very private, very nice indeed. Monk had had it up to his eyebrows with what his landlord had called a bijou terraced character cottage. He'd seen holding cells with more character than 14A Cannon Place. He asked for the details, and a wispy blonde girl with impossibly scarlet high-gloss lips removed a glossy brochure from a filing cabinet and offered it to him. "You would have to move fast on this property, sir. They're going like hotcakes." He smiled at her and said that he would be checking his investments and would ring back later. He folded the brochure in half and slipped it into his inside pocket. Granary Wharf had a swanky sound to it. It would do very nicely, thank you. As always, Freddie was there ahead of him. He sat like a great overdressed Buddha, the usual glass glued to his hand. On the table in front of him were 2 packages, one for him and one for Fabian, and Monk's heart raced at the sight. Freddie waved a hand towards the other sofa. "So, there were no problems?" Monk sat. "None at all. Smooth as silk, Mr. Carver." "And quickly done, Monk. I am impressed." He nodded, smiling serenely. "And Fabian still believes that he was working for the Dutchman?" Monk nodded furiously and accepted the scotch that Freddie was passing him. Good. An excellent job. I'll have no hesitation in using Mr. Fabian again." Monk took a swallow and nodded. "Absolutely, Mr. Carver. He's first class." He looked longingly at the packages, his deposit on Granary Wharf. "Ah, yes. Here we are." A sweaty hand pushed the brown envelopes towards him. "Thank you, boss." He picked them up, noting their very reassuring weight. He pushed one packet deep into an inside pocket and waved the other one at Freddie. "I'll take this to Fabian." He glanced at his watch. "I'm meeting him shortly." "Really?" The familiar, soft, sibilant voice came from behind. Monk span round. The rest of the name was cut short, because the hollow-point bullet had torn away most of his bottom jaw. A second bullet smashed through his left elbow. If he had been a medical man, Monk would have marvelled that the marksman had managed to destroy his humerus, his radius, and his ulna, along with various blood vessels, tendons, ligaments, bursa, and cartilage, all with a single accurate shot. As it was, Monk was no longer capable of registering anything other than intense pain, although in some tiny compartment of his mind that still sparked with consciousness, he did recall why he hated Fabian. It was because Fabian loved his work so very much. Through a hazy, bloody mist, he saw the bloated figure of Freddie Carver. It was laughing. "Silly boy, Monk. Surely you knew that no one rips off Freddie and gets away with it. Whatever were you thinking?
But credit where credit's due. Well done for taking care of Carly, baby. If you hadn't tried to deceive me, I would have been happy to give you this."
He bent over and pulled the package from Monk's stained and torn jacket.
"As it is, well."
In his last few seconds, Monk thought of the girl with the ruby lips. She was handing him the key to his brand new flat in Granary Wharf. Chapter 15. It had taken Steph almost an hour to sneak onto the airfield. The 2 police officers in the car up on the sea bank seemed to be watching one particular area, and she had finally managed to creep past the old pillboxes and into the comparative safety of the overgrown ground around the control tower. The place did not frighten her, although she felt that it should, considering what had happened to Pike, but she knew in her heart that it was a temporary resting place of her brother, and somehow that managed to calm her, give her peace. She thought that maybe he was watching over her. She had no idea why she had come here. The notion had entered her head earlier in the day, and she seemed to have had no option but to obey. She concealed herself in a small, hollowed-out space between a partially collapsed red brick wall and some tall, reedy grass. From this spot, she calculated that she could see most of the deserted buildings and the police car, but remain pretty well hidden. She nestled down, the spiky grass and thistles scratching her legs through her thin black jeans, pulled her fleece jacket around her, and considered her situation. There had been no master plan. She was certainly no avenging angel rescuing her luckless brother where all others had failed. The reason for her journey across miles of farmland, marsh and fen was simple. She wanted to be with Anson. Most people wouldn't understand how she felt about her brother, and why should they? Most people hadn't had to endure their childhood. Steph never allowed herself to wallow in the miseries of the past. She couldn't afford to. It had taken all her strength and all her resolve, but she had finally built a new life for herself and Anson, and it was as far from their tainted upbringing as she could possibly make it. "What goes around comes around," Steph murmured softly into the breeze off the marsh. Then she gave a harsh little laugh. Her father's constant abuse had to end somewhere, and it did on the day that he lifted his hand to Anson, and on that day Steph went to the police. From then on, it was the 2 of them, but Anson wasn't easy. As he grew up, she forgave him for as many of his misdemeanors as she could, and chose to shut her eyes to the others. She leant back against the remains of the wall. That had been her biggest mistake. So here she was, with a shoulder bag containing several small bottles of water, a large bar of chocolate, and a family pack of digestive biscuits. Her meagre rations wouldn't last long, but she was going to stay until they found her brother, and if they didn't, she couldn't even contemplate living without knowing what had happened to him, so it didn't really matter, did it? She pushed the bag beneath the leafy branches of an elder bush and looked around. She wanted to wander about to see if Anson called her to any one particular spot, but she knew she would have to be very careful not to be seen. The last thing she wanted was to be loaded into the back of a police car and taken home again. Not now she had come this far. Steph sat on the ground, hugged her knees and rocked slowly backwards and forwards. Home, she supposed, was now here, this sad and lonely spot, inhabited only by ghosts of the past, and her brother. Tamsin sat at Joseph's home computer with her own laptop to one side of her. One screen was full of archive material that she was using as a point of reference, and the other moved frenetically up and down as she scrolled through different sites. "We need Nikki," muttered Tamsin, "and some background on her father." "I think the murder inquiry might put a lid on that idea." "Damn!" Tamsin hit the keys aggressively. Then she thumbed through some of the old letters from Frank Reed's box. "Well, I've managed to identify another link in the chain." She turned round and looked at Joseph. According to letters from friends and colleagues, Nikki's father had a desk job with the MOD until... She leafed through the letters. 8 years ago. Joseph nodded. "Sounds about right. Nikki said he only gave up work when the first signs of Alzheimer's began to manifest." "There's mention in one of Tug's letters that Frank must be very pleased to be working with one of the old crew again, especially her. Eve, maybe?" "Maybe. And if that's the case, Nikki is right. Tug does know about Eve, even if he's denying it. Where does he live?" "Up until the last letter, a place called Fenton Magna in Dorset." Joseph grunted. "Bit too far away for a quick visit and a quiet word." "Then phone him, and ask him about this as well." Tamsin pointed to some papers. There are 2 more memos here from Eve Anderson, and both have the reference RAF-FM. Joseph walked over to the window and looked out across the marsh. They were getting into murky waters. They needed to find what the MOD's post-war interest in Flaxton Mere was, which would be an impossible job for a civilian and difficult for a police officer. No one in their right mind took on the MOD. At best, it was a waste of time, and at worst, you could find yourself in deep shit. He turned back to his daughter. Right, Tug Owen seems like our only option right now, but do me a favour, and check out the phone listings for his number. I don't want to bother Nikki when she's a man down and has a murder to solve. Tamsin gave him a searching look. You can't wait to get back to work, can you? I'd be lying if I said no. We're a team and a good one. A murder case needs a full complement, but... He looked at her with love in his eyes. And this is a very big but. There is nothing, and I mean nothing, that I'd rather be doing right now other than spending time with my lovely daughter. He was a little sad that Tamsin didn't reply, but then she didn't say anything negative either, so he took it as another baby step forward. He went to the kitchen. He needed a strong coffee before ringing Wing Commander Frank Weed's best buddy. When he returned to Tamsin, she had started on yet another box. I've got Tug Owen's number from an online directory site. It's on the table. Joseph thanked her, placed a mug of coffee beside her, and picked up the number. This could be tricky. He didn't want to put the man's back up, and if he was protecting some dark secret, there was no telling how he would react. Dad? Joseph looked at his daughter. Her expression was both thoughtful and worried. What have you found? Something I wish I hadn't. Tamsin passed him a scuffed, leather-bound notebook. He took it and leafed through it. It wasn't a diary, but each page was crammed with a mass of notes and dates and little scribbled pictures. Joseph sighed. It didn't take long to understand what had upset Tam. The dates spanned 2 decades, and the repeated references to EA made Joseph's heart sink. Nikki's dad was involved with Eve, wasn't he? Tamsin had stood up and was looking over Joseph's shoulder at the book. Look, EA's appointment today worried sick, and EA late for rendezvous getting difficult for her. Wish it was over. I don't think we need an interpreter to get the gist of that, do we? She touched her father's arm. What the hell are we going to tell Nikki? Nothing. Well, nothing until I've spoken to this Tug. If he really was such a solid mate, he'll certainly know if Frank was having an affair. Tamsin frowned. Bastard! It happens, Tam. I'm not defending him, but he never left his wife or Nikki. Maybe he saw sense before it was too late. At least you never cheated on Mum, Tamsin said quietly. She added, you were just in love with your precious career. Joseph lowered his head. There was more to it than that, Tam. It was complicated. Mum said the same thing. For a moment, Joseph thought his daughter was going to open up about why she had chosen to cut him out of her life, but she just picked up her coffee, sipped it, then said, You'd better phone Tug Owen. Excuse me, Niall. That's the second time you've gone all moody on me since I got back to the station. What's the matter? Niall looked at Yvonne anxiously. Would you be prepared to go along with one of Constable Niall Farrow's amazing and mind-blowing hunches? Yvonne frowned. You mean the kind that has no connection to logic or reason? That's the one. Fine. Spill the beans. Now here we have the problem. I'm not sure that I have any beans to spill, but I need to go back to Flaxton Mere. Right. Yvonne looked him full in the face. And this is something that is really, truly bothering you? He didn't have to speak. One look at his tight lips and his definite nod told her everything. Then we should tell Galena. What if I'm wrong? I've nothing concrete to tell her. If anyone understands the importance of hunches, it's the inspector. Yvonne picked up her hat from the table. So if you won't tell her, I will. As Yvonne and Niall arrived at Flaxton Mere, they saw 2 white-suited Sokos moving in and out of the store where the footprints had been found. Have we got time to see what they've come up with? Yvonne asked. Niall nodded miserably. Sure, Galena's not here yet, and my big hunch could be a crock of shit anyway. Batman and Robin, welcome to the Cocaine Kids' hidey hole. The Soko on duty grinned as they approached, and guess what? There were 2 sets of prints on the floor. We've lifted them both, and one is a much bigger shoe size than the light trainers you lot noticed.
We've photographed them, and from the difference in stride, we reckoned your second visitor is much taller than the first.
2 people?
Yep, and there were a lot of prints. This was no one-off visit. We'll get this stuff back to the lab and see what the experts can tell us.
The Soko placed the sealed evidence bags into a plastic case and loaded it into the back of his car before stripping off his protective suit.
Right, well, I'm through here. See ya.
As he drove off, Yvonne looked at her partner and said,
OK, let's hear what's bugging you about this dreary place.
Niall strode off in the direction of one of the pillboxes.
It's something to do with these things.
He stood outside the first one, took a deep breath, and ducked inside. This time Yvonne followed, and was immediately confronted by a wall of graffiti. She smiled, understanding that Wayne may well be a wanker, but what Shaz had to do to become a yum-yum girl left her wondering. Niall was stamping around, kicking piles of debris from one side of the pillbox to the other.
There's nothing here. How many of these things were there?
5. The last one we looked at, the one where you bumped your head, that was bigger and it had that wall inside.
Niall smacked the side of his forehead.
You've got it, Vonnie.
I have.
Yes, I bumped my head, I dropped my torch, and I thought I'd bust the glass. Considering the thickness of the concrete, it was lucky it didn't shatter.
Niall was almost running across the waste ground.
Come on.
And your point being?
Yvonne trotted after him.
There's a smaller one, near the boundary fence, and it's got a different kind of floor. OK, it might be nothing, but there are enough passages and underground places in this dump to warrant checking it out. It could be another tunnel.
As they approached the old wartime defence, Yvonne felt a shiver course through her body, and she instinctively reached out and stopped Niall from charging inside.
Be careful. This doesn't feel right somehow.
They went in with caution, not speaking, but each trusted the other's instincts. Yvonne stamped on the floor with her regulation black shoe heel. It felt pretty solid to her.
Over here, Yvonne.
Niall dropped to his knees and began scraping at the ground.
I bloody well knew it, look.
As she watched, he lifted a large sheet of something that looked like a plaster-covered loft hatch and revealed a heavy wooden trapdoor beneath.
Hold it, Niall. Not without the governor. And we should call for backup.
Her shivers had turned into full-blown tremors.
I'll ring a mobile and get her ETA, and I'll go and get Bob and Reg from the squad car. Don't lift that hatch until I get back, understand?
Niall knew there was no arguing with her. Nikki had been parking her car beneath the watch office when she got the call, and within 10 minutes, 5 officers were staring down a steep flight of stone steps. As their torch beams met in a small empty room, Niall began lowering himself down.
Hey, someone has been using this place. There's a lantern. Come down, the stairs are safe.
Niall pulled on gloves and tried the lantern. Instantly, the whitewashed room sprang to life.
There's no dust or dirt here. What do you make of it?
It's more a case of what do we make of that?
Nikki pointed to the only other thing in the room, a solid wooden door with freshly oiled hinges and lock. PC Bob Tinker moved across to it and tried to turn the handle.
Locked, and I wouldn't like to put my shoulder to that. We'll need an enforcer.
Yvonne eyed it up and down, then looked at their beefy colleague Reg.
There's a shovel in the boot of our vehicle. Do you think you can smash that lock?
A big smile spread across Reg's face.
Oh yes, I should think so. I'll go fetch it. And Mum, should I radio in while I'm above ground?
Nikki paused.
Let's find out what we've got first. Just get the shovel for starters.
The lock flew halfway across the room, and to the screeching sound of splintering wood, the door ceased to be a problem. Niall moved forward with the 3 others close behind him, and slowly pulled it open.
More steps.
What the fuck?
Reg's whispered inquiry tailed away.
What in heaven's name is this place?
Niall was making his way down the steps, shining his torch from one side to the other. Moving closely together, Nikki, Yvonne and the others followed him. When they reached the bottom step, they stopped and looked around.
It's a crypt, isn't it? An underground chapel.
Nikki could hear Niall swallowing.
Look at that ceiling. It's vaulted like a church and there are candles all over.
Which means it's being used.
Yvonne's voice had a slight tremor.
Black magic, Reg offered. So where's the altar? More like a religious cult. The candles are cream, not black.
Niall sounded dazed. They slowly moved away from the steps, beams of light bouncing off the pale stone of the ancient walls.
Oh God, what is that?
Yvonne's powerful light was glinting on something distinctly unchurch-like, high-tech and made of steel. 4 other beams met hers, and there, centre stage, stood a mortuary table.
"I think we've just found your altar, Reg," said Nikki. "Some bloody altar? This is like something out of Frankenstein."
"Yeah, all we need is some creepy freak playing the organ," Bob said with bravado. Niall had moved away from the small group, past the table up on its raised stone pedestal, and was looking through a massive archway.
"Mom?"
His voice sounded hollow, and his tone immediately stopped the banter.
"I think it's time to get back up."
Nikki and Yvonne moved to his side, and stared at the scene in front of them.
"It's,"
whispered Yvonne.
"My God, it's a cemetery."
Through the archway, and several feet lower than the area in which they stood, was another vaulted chamber. Nikki didn't need her torch to see, as 4 huge candles were already burning, 1 in each corner of the crypt. Nikki's hand flew to her mouth as she gazed at the coffins, lines of them, stacked on stone ledges, one above the other, from the dusty stone floor to the shadowy roof. Some, the higher ones, were old rotting caskets that belonged to a bygone age, in heavy dark wood with ornate brass fittings. And below those, row upon row of identical plain wooden coffins. Niall slowly moved towards the nearest wooden box, but Yvonne grasped his shoulder.
"This is not for us, Niall. We need forensics down here."
"I think," said Nikki haltingly, "I think that we need to see for ourselves what we are dealing with."
She took a deep breath and pulled on her gloves.
"These newer ones are not even nailed down. I'll hold the torch. Bob, you put your gloves on and carefully open it. But don't touch a thing."
Together they lifted the first lid, and then the second, and the third. Each coffin contained a body. Nikki felt as if her brain had stopped functioning. Then she looked up and saw Niall. He was staring slack-mouthed directly into an open casket.
"This one looks like it's sleeping."
He lowered the lid and asked blankly,
"Why? Why is that?"
"Because they've all been embalmed, that's why." A shiver shot like an icy arrow between Nikki's shoulders.
"Can't you smell the chemicals?"
She moved on to the next coffin and pushed up the lid. A face looked up at her, a young dead face surrounded by a halo of corn-blonde curls. The naked body was covered with a thin white sheet and seemed unblemished, other than the neat stitching running from ear to ear. Suddenly, she'd seen enough.
"Come on, let's get out of here. Yvonne was right. This is a major crime scene. We're wrecking it. We shouldn't be here."
"And I suppose that goes for her, too." Bob Tinker pointed in the direction of the thin, saucer-eyed woman who stood, like a wraith herself, immediately behind him.
"Anson?"
Chapter 16. The innocuous-looking pillbox, the kind that no one looked twice at, was lit up like Southend Pier. Every available officer had been brought in to contain the site, and Professor Rory Wilkinson had conjured up forensic science officers from across 5 counties. Yvonne sat on a grass-covered mound with Steph Taylor and watched the white suits move in and out of the pillbox like worker beeves at a hive. Steph had refused to leave the area, and nothing anyone could say would budge her. And Yvonne, whose 2 lovely brothers were safe in the bosom of their families, understood completely. If Robin or Harry had been lying dead in that awful place, she would have done the same. From the moment she had seen the strange space with its rows of coffins, Yvonne had known that Anson Taylor would be found there. So did his sister. And so they sat together in silence, watching and waiting for the inevitable.
"Well, this certainly beats the Paris catacombs."
Rory looked with something like admiration at the niches cut out of the walls in order to store the great collection of coffins.
"It's a burial chamber like no other I've ever seen."
"Thank God for that," Nikki growled. "I'd hate to think this sort of thing was commonplace. What the hell has been going on here, Rory?"
The pathologist pushed his glasses higher up his nose and said,
"Apart from the obvious, that is the lair of the mother of all serial killers and the resting place of 19 of his victims."
Nikki bit hard on her thumbnail.
"It's that thing that gives me the bloody creeps. What the hell is it? And how did it get down here?"
Her gaze was directed at the steel table, raised up on its podium and lit from all angles by their halogen lights.
Now, I can tell you exactly what that is, dear Detective Inspector. Let me show you."
He stepped up onto the raised area, Nikki following reluctantly.
"This is a relocatable mortuary facility. Look."
He pointed down to a recessed area just behind the table and a few steps lower.
"See, it's not just a table, it's the whole shebang."
Good God! Nikki looked down into a small, purpose-built modular panelled room. She put her hands on her hips, jutted her chin forward and asked, "Okay, what am I looking at?"
"Everything you require for your post-mortem and body storage, including instrument and organ sink, dissecting area, scales, low-level tray sluice, an excellent stacking trolley, a stainless steel 3-bay by 5-tier refrigerated body storage cabinet, and an air extraction unit, which I happen to know is capable of more than 20 air changes per hour on a negative pressure."
Hold it right there. So this is high-tech stuff. How does it operate in a bloody crypt?
"I should think that the large generator in the adjoining cellar has quite a lot to do with it."
Rory smiled benignly.
"But all this equipment most definitely did not come in the way we did, and since we aren't in Narnia, it certainly didn't arrive through the back of a wardrobe. I think you need to start looking for another entrance. Now, I have to go back to the victims. It's going to take forever to get them all DNA tested and into a proper storage facility for post-mortem examination."
He stopped and shook his head.
"And right now, our county facility at Fenchester Hospital, the one that's kitted out to cope with epidemics and major disasters, is undergoing a refit. So, unless we use refrigerated lorries, I'm seriously considering keeping them here."
"Really? Or is that just one of your famous ever-so-slightly dubious jokes?"
"I'm deadly serious. The conditions down here are exceptional. Some of those bodies are beautifully preserved, a credit to the mortician. Well, except that he probably murdered them in the first place."
"I suppose he's hardly likely to come back when he sees this circus. What are you proposing?"
"That I do the initial work in situ. Not the full post-mortems, but I can catalogue them, take samples, and bag up any evidence right here. That can go straight to the lab, then we can seal the coffins. It will help to avoid cross-contamination."
It was possible. In the circumstances, Nikki could afford a full team to mount security and protection for the technicians, and they would certainly get men drafted in from other divisions. She looked around her and shivered. The obvious horrors of the strange, cavernous scene of crime had overshadowed other, more subtle aspects. Apart from the beautifully preserved victims, there were dozens of carefully trimmed candles, big oil burners for sweet-scented oils, and a huge glass bowl full of fresh flowers and grasses. Nikki drew in a long breath. There was going to